Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today, bringing you the recap for Kaijudo Open number 9, which happened a while ago now, but yeah, another long form tournament. This time it was actually our biggest tournament we've had so far, I think, with 10 players, which was nice to see. I think the big thing was Caleb 123 actually showed up and brought in a couple other players who were newcomers with Papids and Boingus. I think they're a play group that at least plays together. I'm not exactly sure on all the details, but I think Caleb joined the tournament late and then invited a couple new players to join, which was really nice to see. So I think Papids is um, Brian, who won the last championship, if I'm correct, and then Caleb also a player from back in the day. I know he topped an LCQ at least. I think maybe a KMC or two. I believe Papids also won not only the championship but also KMC back in the day. So a couple accomplished players. Not sure who Boingus is, but I'm sure another decent player if he's involved. So it was really nice to get up to 10 players. So yeah, what we did this time was kind of an interesting structure where we did kind of two groups of 5 and then round robin within each group, and then the top 2 players from each group advanced to a single elimination bracket. And so yeah, going over the pods, I mean, unfortunately, like all the new players got put in the same one. Caleb, Papids, and Boingus are put in a pod with myself and Andros. Of course, so the decks, I'll talk about them all quite in depth, but Caleb brought a very interesting mono dark list. I brought maybe something a bit off the radar, maybe a little hated, is the Coral Lock deck that I profiled recently on the channel. So I brought that list. Papids brought a Light Dark Nature Haven, a ramp deck, not a pile deck. It was a 40 card slim ramp deck. Andros brought an interesting Light Nature Skyforce champion deck. Boingus brought a Dark Nature Evolution deck, kind of reminiscent of Mono Nature, but with a lot of darkness, Shield Blast creatures and stuff like that. So definitely an interesting pod. Caleb ended up defeating me and finishing 3-1. I finished 3-1, beating everyone else below. And then Papids, of course, finished 2-2. So interesting mix of decks, but then yeah, of course, Caleb and I made it out of the group stage. The second pod has some more familiar names. Claude Alpha, who's played a lot, ended up being the only person to go 4-0, playing a mono water deck actually, which was quite interesting. Another Neuron list that he's been on that kind of Neuron kick the last few tournaments, so brought another list and ended up doing quite well in the group stage. Otai, I think this is his first time playing, but he's been a little more active in the Discord server recently, and he and I have played a number of casual games as well, just somewhat recently. So nice to see him join. And this pod had a little bit more, because Claude ended up going 4-0, ended up being a little bit more of a tiebreaker scrum, unfortunately, which kind of dislike to see, but that's kind of the nature of this kind of format, unfortunately. But Otai ended up making it out with a 2-2 record, beating out Darksigner. So Otai on his own variant of Fire Dark Taksha, and then Darksigner this time around brought Light Water Fire Oath Dragons, but with his own kind of twist. Of course, IRL, he usually plays the deck that he has built in paper, and IRL he does not own like the Andromeda Awakens, so he's building around Supreme Dragon Bullshack instead. But other than that, it's pretty much like a straight up Oath Dragon list. So Darksigner ended up bringing that, finishing 2-2, and unfortunately lost to Otai in the head-to-head, so Otai got the tiebreaker to advance a little bit further. And then, of course, Darksigner, I think, lost to both people above him, of course, so kind of makes sense that he finished his third place. And then Stents, back in action, been quite a while, I think, since he's played in one of these tournaments, but good to see him back. He brought a kind of much more experimental Water, Fire, Nature, Dragon, Fight Dragon type thing, with like Krogon being the main card there, I guess, just Water, Fire, Nature, Dragons. And then Louis, of course, finishing 1-3 as well, unfortunately playing, I think, a Water Dark Nature Light kind of mid-rangey tempo deck, like a lot of just good stuff kind of pile, like a lot of the good stuff like Cyber Scamp, Keeper of Laws, Targusher, some Blinder Beetle Prime, some Agorix, Underworld Stalker, like basically like Arbiter, Piercing, every good card you could think of for the most part is just kind of chilling in the list. So just a Light Water Dark Nature good stuff deck. And then I mean, with the two kind of most aggressive like slim Evo decks kind of took down the pod with the Fire Dark Taksha and the Wana Water Emperor Pallado Emperor Neuron deck. So those decks kind of make sense. Like Oath Dragons kind of struggles with those kind of things, and then Stents' deck was a bit more of like a heavy 50 card dragon list that had a little bit more clunkiness, not a lot of defense for those big evolutions. Ended up losing, I think, both those matches. And then Louis' deck, kind of interesting. I think he lost to both of the Dragon decks, which kind of makes sense for maybe a bit more mid-rangey deck. And then, of course, beat one of the Evo aggro decks, and then I think lost a kind of tight match against Claude. So he is one win away from maybe like taking down, finishing up there as well. So a close race in this pod as well, but then Claude, of course, having the best tournament in the bracket stage. So ended up being how the group stages, which was kind of interesting. I like this format a little bit. It was fun to just have the groups going, and most of all, it was nice to have a big tournament. But yeah, as far as how things actually finished up, the final stage. So of course, what ended up happening, the top player from each group played the second highest player from the other group. So of course, what ended up happening, Caleb took it all down. He beat Otai in a narrow match, 2-1. I ended up losing my Coral Lock deck, kind of not being quite good enough to take down Claude. So 2 close matches there, 2-1s, and then Caleb ended up beating Claude 2-0 in the finals. So Caleb took it down with his like pretty interesting mono dark deck that we'll get into, and another Terrapit deck winning, which is kind of not too common. Not too many people have actually won with Terrapit. I think it's just me, Raijinku, and Caleb now that have won. I think there's only been, I don't know, I might have to go back and check, but I feel like there's only been 3 Terrapit decks that have won these tournaments so far, despite Terrapit being maybe like the most played card, I want to say. So kind of interesting. But yeah, of course, we also had a third place match, and I ended up beating Otai in that. So I finished third, I think, going 4-2 overall, and then Caleb and Claude both went 5-1 overall in the tournament. So good performances from both of them. A lot of interesting decks. So I guess congrats again to Caleb, and we'll get into the list in specific. All right, so I'd like to start by talking about the Dark Nature Evolution, I guess aggro, midrange, whatever you want to call it, deck that was brought by Boingus. So I think what's really interesting about this list and a few of the other ones in the tournament is it really highlights sort of some different approaches, philosophies with deck building that I'd like to kind of point out. And I think this deck, along with the list brought by Papids and then, of course, Caleb himself, I think they were all built by Caleb, and then he kind of invited some of his friends or people from his play group and then gave them decks. That's my understanding, at least from what I talked with Papids and Boingus, what I picked up from them. So I believe all these lists were built by Caleb, and I think, again, like I said, it shows a little bit of a different philosophy in deck building than my own approach, and I kind of want to talk about that. But before I get into it, I would like to at least discuss this list in general. So of course, again, Dark Nature Evolution, a lot of the suspects you'd suspect with like the similar to Mono Nature, where you have the Broodmother and then the big Evo package. But compared to Mono Nature, it's obviously a lot less consistent. It has a much clunkier early game, less cheap creatures. Doesn't have the same suite of powerful, really explosive 3-drops. As much card advantage, lacking the Sun Clans, Muck Tax, all that kind of stuff. Instead, just playing, I guess to be fair, like Bronze Arm Tribe and Lurking Orchard are that kind of advantage source, but they're obviously much lower cards. And then Time Lost as well, but it's a much more high variance card. But it does have some weaknesses against aggro, where it's kind of a volatile card to use. But that is a big engine of this deck, is just having the super high Shield Blast count, especially with stuff like Lurking Orchid, which, again, pretty inefficient as a castable card, but still kind of okay when you're leading into things like Scared Orbital Behemoth. But then when you can get it out with the Time Lost Phantom, especially on the play, like if you can swing and hit it on turn 3, it leads to some pretty powerful draws. So there is some high upside with this deck, but kind of as I touched on, overall, it is a lot clunkier than a deck like Mono Nature, where Water Nature or any of these other like Nature Evolution decks, when you have just so many kind of mediocre castable cards in the deck. A lot of them are kind of slow, clunky, a ton of expensive, like basically brick Shield Blast, like with the 5/8 drops, and a lot of these other cards. So it leads to much more slow, clunky draws, less aggressive. You don't back up your Time Lost Phantom super well, and you're kind of banking on having some of those triggers in time to, or the Shield Blast in time to protect it. You're a little less or a little lighter on the evolution stuff with the lower Great Claw count and the lower Anjac count. And then Behemoth is another big part of this deck as well. It is just, I mean, it's a card that's kind of comparable to Boulder Fist and being that top end that kind of just pushes through your opponent's board. Obviously, in general, I just believe it's a much weaker card than Boulder Fist, a lot harder to use. To be honest, I don't know about even playing 3 copies in this deck. I definitely don't think it's a reason to play Dark Nature. Like, it's not something that puts it over the top. It's not an advantage of playing the deck. Like, just playing a more focused deck that's better supporting Boulder Fist is better in my opinion. So like I said, I don't think it's really a reason to branch out into Darkness is Behemoth. It's just a card you can play that will be pretty decent if you do happen to play Darkness, is more how I think about it. It's not really a reward or a payoff. It's more just something that you can play as a consequence. And again, it's a fine card. I don't know about 3 copies. Obviously, it makes sense when you have all these Darkness Shield Blast creatures that you can kind of spit out there. They don't do much otherwise, so that being able to convert those bodies into something else can be pretty impactful, and that's part of why like a card like Boulder Fist is a little less suited in this deck than maybe Mono Nature. But still, I think you could even still play one or 2 Boulder Fists instead or in complement. So yeah, I think the Behemoth is okay, but again, I don't know about the full 3 copies. But yeah, the rest of the deck is fine. Again, it kind of just, to get into more of what I was leading into when I wanted to discuss sort of more of the different philosophy in deck building, that's kind of what I want to talk. So I'll spend a bit more time on this list, I think, going over that. But there's definitely a much different philosophy, because when you look at a lot of the decks that I build, or even like players like Darkness Signer, for example, I think have similar philosophies to mine, where it's much more focused on the cards you're drawing, having good plays, and just redundancy on your curve, all that kind of stuff, where it's a little more focused on just what your draw is doing. And you look at a deck like this, and some of the other decks we'll see as well later into the tournament, they're just much more of these like kind of mishmashy, have a little bit of everything, like or even an abundance of defensive cards, like all these extra Shield Blasts that are just pretty weak cards to draw, but just having a very high count of Shield Blast, having the mix of like top endy stuff, having some early game stuff, but not a ton of redundancy on the early game stuff, and then instead having just replacing that and kind of skimping down on a lot of the redundancy, the consistency, or even the optionality in different spots in your curve, skimming down or cutting down on a lot of that, and then again just upping the Shield Blast count. So I think what it leads to is you have this kind of this, on one hand, it's more of a kind of a high variance approach, because when you think about how Kaijudo works as a game, I mean, I think this is something I mentioned for a number of times, but Kaijudo is kind of a very forgiving game in when you're in, so far as you're approaching it this way, right? Because not all the cards that you're drawing need to be active, need to be live. You're not punished super bad for having weak cards in your hand or anything like that, because as a game, Kaijudo, like if you're going into turn 5, you're curving out on the play or draw, whatever, you're basically charging half the cards that you see and playing the other half. So you don't need to have like the requirement in terms of the level of card, like how many cards you need to be really good, is not that high, right? Now, that's kind of what this deck, these kinds of builds are aiming for, right? Because you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you can draw just enough good cards to curve out somewhat, to play an aggressive game, to hit your plays on curve that you want. You can just draw enough of those cards to make something together, and then at the same time you just charge all the bad cards you're drawing, all the artichokes, all the like extra Den Gorgers and stuff. Like, you just throw all these crap cards down. So you charge the bad half, you play the good half, and so you're still making plays, you're still curving out, and then you have this upside of a much more impactful shield zone that can help you make up a lot of ground or win racing situations, bail you out of tough spots, all that sort of stuff. So it is this kind of high variance approach where you get to kind of have the best of both worlds. But of course, like, the advantage on the other side of things is when you have more redundancy on your curve, you're hitting your plays more consistently, you're curving out more effectively. Oftentimes you have more flexible options, more variety of options at each spot in the curve, so you can better adjust and adapt to your opponent, what your opponent's doing, or what role you need to play in the matchup, because you have more optionality in the cards in your hand. There's more activity, there's more live cards, basically. This deck, you're really restricting your card activity, your virtual card advantage, in the sense of like what you can actually play each turn. But again, you're aiming for that upside of the high impact shield zone. And I think that's a much different philosophy than what I focus a lot more on, like the linearity of decks, having that redundancy, the consistency and such like that. But I mean, consistency is a weird word as well, because at the end of the day, all that really matters is consistently winning. And there's a lot of different ways you can approach that. Not just like having consistent 2-drop on turn 2. It doesn't, like having a consistent 2-drop attacker, it doesn't always matter, right? Like it's, again, there's all sorts of different things going on, all sorts of different approaches. All that really matters is consistently winning at the end of the day. And I think this is still a decent approach at that. I think it depends on the deck. I think it really depends on the deck what works, because in a sense, to make another gaming kind of analogy, is like when you're building a character or whatever. I don't know, I don't play too many video games, but like there's a lot of games where you can kind of pick your stats and have different distributions of stats and all that sort of stuff. And whatever, you can go super in on 1 or 2 stats, maybe go for a well-rounded character or something like that. And I think this is kind of an approach where you are just trying to spread out those stats and trying to build a well-rounded deck. Again, those shield blasts kind of raise your floor in a sense, where like you can kind of just beat anything by just having those draws where you just see the right amount of curve, you have enough shield blasts to kind of bail you out. Because again, the consistency aspect, like you might not consistently see your plays, but then that kind of you make up that ground when you just have a better shield zone, so that kind of makes up the ground that you've lost by just missing tempo on your regular turns on curve, and now you just make up that ground by just having a bunch of shield blasts. And so like overall, it kind of, where things actually come out, again at the end of the day, the final measuring stick is consistently winning. And so like maybe you don't consistently have plays, but you more consistently have shield blasts, and that kind of just balances out in certain matchups in a way where you do come out ahead. I think with this deck in particular, you do come out behind, because again, I think when you kind of make that stats analogy, it's kind of, with this deck in particular, I felt a lot of it was kind of underwhelming, and it just becomes like an inefficient distribution of stats. I think like you're playing too many of these cards where, again, you can have a chance at beating anything, but the problem is you're just not really consistently good. There's nothing like super exceptional or super redeeming about this approach either at the same time, right? So again, you can kind of have a chance at anything with that mix of curve, powerful cards, shield blasts, but you're not doing anything particularly well. You're not great against any control decks, because again, you're just like a much more inconsistent version of Mono Nature, a less powerful version of Mono Nature. And then at the same time, you are also like against aggro matchups, like you're still kind of an inconsistent, clunky deck on the face of things. Sometimes your shield blasts don't matter, they're poorly timed, all that sort of stuff. I think it's just a more high variance approach. It's a little bit underwhelming, and I don't think it has too many good matchups. Like again, you have a chance at everything, but it's just kind of an inefficient mix and a distribution of all the different elements, to the point where like you have a lot of 40% matchups or 45% matchups, but it ends up being kind of purposeless, because where's the redeeming quality, right? Like, yeah, you have a chance against everything, but you're never playing a matchup where you're happy to play it, or you're comfortably favored or anything like that. Or not never, but you're rarely feeling that way. So I think overall, again, that's something that kind of depends on the decks, because you can take this kind of broad approach, this kind of approach can be applied in general. Like this is sort of a deck building philosophy, right? The way you mix those cards. And I think this is a pattern I see amongst like almost all the decks that were brought by Caleb. And then I think even Otai's deck, I think, has some of these elements as well. And I think it can work for some decks better than others. And I think you can definitely see the philosophy kind of being applied to all these different decks. And again, I think it's something that you kind of have to assess for each deck, whether it works or not. And I think this is a case where, again, I think it's a pretty fine deck, but there's just nothing special about it. Like it's just nothing that's really, like I don't see a purpose in this deck existing in the metagame, basically, is what I'm getting at. Like it's decent. It can beat a bunch of different stuff if the things go well for it, but it's just, on average, it's just kind of bad against, or mediocre, or just always coming out behind a lot of different decks. So again, I just don't think it's that great. And I think I was talking about this kind of stuff as well with my brother, Gareth, and I think he just coined it like the the Mario versus Luigi theory of deck building, where like the Mario is just like the super well-rounded, just kind of okay at everything, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of this middling, like you don't really have any, you're not like exceptional, you're not super great against anything, you're not super bad against anything, but you want to be more of like a Luigi. Like, you have more purpose as a Luigi where you excel at some things and you can leverage that to actually get an advantage. And yeah, you have disadvantages, but then that gives you more of a purpose. Whereas these kind of decks goes to where sometimes it is good to be a Mario, right? Some decks are better as a Mario, right? But it has to be in the right area where you have to assess like because there's a line where a Mario is good or not, and that depends like if you're actually winning these or on the front winning side of a number of those matchups. Like, you have to have being a deck that has a chance against everything is good, but not if you're on the losing side of all these matchups, right? You actually have to be favored against a significant amount, or like be playing a bunch of 55s, not a bunch of 45s, right? And that's the kind of thing you have to be realistic about. So I think applying this kind of deck building approach can be good when it's in the right areas, but at the same time, there's a lot of decks where you just build in this way and it's kind of pointless, right? And then at the flip side too, when you take the other approach, some decks, when you build them super linearly, maybe they end up being too high roll in that sense where they don't have enough flexibility, they're too exploitable. So you have to kind of balance these things more, and there's these different philosophies with deck building, especially in Kaijudo. Again, very forgiving game. It allows you to build in these ways. Like other games, you can't afford to play this many bricky cards in your deck because you don't have the leniency of the Kaijudo mana system in other games. So getting that affords to build, and like navigating that is a really tricky part of Kaijudo deck building. And so I think it's a pretty interesting dynamic, and there's always ways you can work on the balance. And I think with this list in this deck, I think it was overtuned in one direction. But I mean, at the same time, like it kind of makes sense, like thematically. So you're building around Time Lost Phantom, you just want a high Shield Blast count. It's kind of straightforward, right? But I think overall, the deck itself, I wasn't really impressed at all by it in the ways I played it. I just felt kind of lacking in a lot of areas. Again, overall, the deck decent. I think Boingus ended up playing. He ended up not playing against Andros. To be fair, I feel like that was a match that maybe he would win if he had played it out. But the other three matches, I think he defeated Papids on the Light Dark Nature Haven deck, which I can see. The Light Dark Nature Haven deck in particular was a build that I don't think was particularly well suited against aggro. It was a little clunky, honestly, not going to lie. So I think that deck, I could definitely see it losing to the aggro decks. Didn't watch the matches, of course, but even a deck like this, but that's kind of the problem with this deck as well. Like, you can just have really slow clunky draws, and when that happens, like against control matchups, all that upside of trying to play both ways, where you can have your good curve and also have the upside of your shield zone. The upside of your shield zone is irrelevant in a lot of matchups, and that's another big drawback of a deck like this. So, yeah, having having that extra brickiness compared to other more consistent linear aggressive decks, it is not something that matters at all, and you're only dealing with downside in a matchup like the Haven deck. So, I think that game, maybe it was three games, I can't remember, but yeah, beating the Haven deck and then losing to Caleb, I think that one maybe was the 3-gamer. And then also I beat Boingus as well. I know for me, I was kind of nervous about the matchup. I think Coral Lock, one of the worst matchups for me so far in my experience, what has been like these mono nature aggressive decks, water nature, mono nature, those kinds of decks just really are difficult to deal with. Some of the most difficult aggressive decks to deal with. But again, I felt a lot more comfortable in a matchup like this where, again, like there's so many more dead cards, dead draws. The aggressive draws are a lot less consistent. Only having like 3 Anjaks was kind of a big deal as well. So, yeah, I felt this matchup was a lot more comfortable, but still kind of scary if they draw enough of the cards that are relevant. But the reality is there just weren't too many cards that I was scared of compared to more traditional mono nature. So, yeah, overall, I think decent deck, 1-3 record. Maybe could have gone 2-2 in the pod if it was played out with Andros. I'm not sure, but yeah. So like overall decent deck, but I think not something I'm a super big fan of compared to some of the other decks I've seen in these tournaments so far. But definitely decent. So yeah, that's Dark Nature from Boingus in this tournament. So for the next deck, we have the Light Nature Skyforce Champion deck bought by Andros. So another deck that went 1-3 in the pod. Again, his one win was a concession from Boingus, who couldn't finish off playing the tournament. Lost, I think, 2-0 to myself playing Korolok. Lost 2-1 to Caleb, and then lost 2-0 to Papids as well. So got a game off Caleb, but the rest of the matches didn't go so well. So I guess getting into the deck, I think the main card to note is Veil Rift. I guess that's where most of the deck kind of comes from. It's what it revolves around. So Veil Rift, card from Eye of the Storm. You look at the top 5, all the 6k or better creatures or higher creatures, they go into your hand. So ideally, I remember Andros told me the stats. I don't remember them off the top of my head, but ideally you're trying to draw like 3 or 4 cards off of this card and then leverage that into the mid game where you can just start spitting out Skyforce champions and doing your thing, just Jazuring thing or Azuri, Jazuri and Azuri, just evolving, doing stuff, beating down. Maybe you have a more aggressive draw with Haven's Council where you can just play an Ironwood Tree and then play Full Metal and then play Haven's Council and then maybe just start beating down. You have Oathsworn Call as your kind of only defensive blast, but of course there is the high blocker count with 12 different cheap blockers at least, and then maybe some more if you count the others. But Oathsworn Call gives you a way to maybe cheese against some aggro decks by just dropping out an early 6k creature, trying to dominate the board that way. So yeah, that's kind of the idea. Unfortunately, I don't really think there's... I don't know if there's really that much to say. It's maybe a lesson in why there's more to card advantage than just raw card advantage. Like drawing a bunch of somewhat redundant cards and expensive cards at that, it just doesn't really translate well. Like a lot of the point of card advantage is either you get a bunch of optionality so that you can have a bunch of different cards to choose from to better kind of adjust and make good plays, right? Like when you have 5 different cards in hand, you have a lot of options in terms of how you play your turn. You can usually find a good option for that turn, and that having more cards in your hands means more options, which means presumably your play is going to get better the more options you have, right? So that's part of what card advantage can translate to on each turn, because obviously the other bottleneck is your tempo, how much mana you have access to, and that's one of the other ways you can leverage your card advantage is by doing a ton of things, right? If you can leverage your card advantage by having 5 cards in hand and getting to play 3 of them when your opponent has like 1 card in hand and they can only play 1 play. That's another way you get ahead, is by just doing a ton of things, and you need card advantage to do a ton of things, right? So these are the way you need some way to actually leverage the card advantage. And in this deck, when you're drawing kind of all somewhat replaceable, they're all just kind of 6k creatures that do some different things. There's not too much optionality there, and at the same time you're not leveraging your card advantage in a tempo way, because you can only play one big thing a turn. So you just end up with a lot of maybe excess stuff. So even if you drew like 4 or 5 cards off of Veil Rift every time, maybe that would help you as like a threat-based deck against some control stuff, maybe some slow, dirtle, mid-range. But for the most part, it's just not going to be good, even if it did draw like 4 or 5 cards every time. At least not with the quality of cards, because again, like, it's a Skyforce champion deck. Like Haven's Council or Haven's Elite is not really a good card. Haven's Council, it's a 4 for 6, but you're not a very aggressive deck to leverage that too well, especially when you're going kind of -2 in a sense to play these blockers that don't pressure aggressively. Their only real purpose is maybe to chump block to protect the council, but again, you're just investing so much in just this 4 mana 6k that's probably not going to go the distance. So yeah, there's just not too much that can go well. Lepidos will probably rarely work beyond some like maybe Winmori type scenarios. And then even Oathsworn Call is a shield blast. Obviously it's gotten some notoriety in our play group and how it's being leveraged with Herald of Infernus, but even like a turn 1, like an early broken Haven's Elite, it's like doesn't do that much. Like a lot of aggro decks, like maybe it sucks, maybe they have to not attack that turn, it gets to kill something, but you can just recycle it and move on. It's not a huge game-ending threat the same way like an Oathsworn down Vang can be on an early turn, or an Oathsworn down Herald. So yeah, I don't think like Oathsworn's really too much enough to like to stem the bleeding against aggro decks. Obviously, like it can do some work, but You're not the best at translating or leveraging that Oathsworn into like a racing scenario. It's not, your deck doesn't really have the pressure speed to do that. So yeah, overall, I just don't think this deck can do too much. Yeah, I just don't think it really works, unfortunately. I mean, personally, I don't find it unfortunate because I could really care less about Skyforce champions, but maybe it's unfortunate for the people who are really rooting for stuff like Haven's Elite and Azuri to make it into some kind of a competitive fashion. But yeah, to be honest, I just don't care much for those cards. But yeah, so that was the Light Nature deck. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out too well. Maybe somewhat predictably, but I guess worth a try to see how it could fare. So that was the Light Nature Skyforce champion that was brought by Andros, and we'll move on to the next deck. All right, so this is the Light Dark Nature Haven deck that was brought by Pappets to the tournament. So 40 cards, super slim, still in the list. I think he played it to a 2-2 record, pretty close to going 3-1. I think if he had beaten Boingus, it would have been a 3-way tie at 3-1 in the pod, which would have been kind of awkward. But I guess lucky for the rest of us, he ended up losing that match 2-1, and then ended up finishing 2-2, beating Andros, beating Caleb, I think actually was the person to take down Caleb, and then losing to myself and Boingus, of course. So finished pretty close, but yeah, this deck, I think it was one of the decks that honestly I think I honestly overrated it at first when I first looked at it, because I mean, Light Dark Nature Haven is a deck I like tried things with. I've looked at it a lot of times, and I just felt like I was always kind of overwhelmed in the deck building process. Just never really found a mix of cards that I was kind of happy with or wanted to proceed with. I usually just kind of got overwhelmed, built like some medium deck, and then just didn't really feel like it was good, didn't like the look of it. And I felt like this deck maybe had kind of solved some of the issues by just approaching it differently, because usually what happened is I just got overwhelmed by all the different cards, because one of the key things is just building around, I really wanted to use Absolute Darkness and Andromeda. I think that's like one of the key things. It's just these cards I think just complement each other really well, as well, in a sense. Like your opponent's kind of forced to go wide to get through Andromeda and play around it and whatever, and Absolute Darkness really punishes that. And then but I mean, they're also just they're just like the two best like big stabilizing cards I think in a lot of matchups. So I just really like having high counts of both of those. But I think what made it awkward for me is I just always tried to fit. There was just too many darkness cards that I was trying to fit in. That all these different mid-rangey stuff, whether it's like the removal spells like Bone Blades and Terror Pit, or trying to find space for all the discard stuff like Mesmerize and Spire Puppet, and all these other cards. Maybe if you're playing with Eye of the Storm, there was the idea of like playing Vangs and playing even like maybe Darkwood Tribes or things like that. There was always just so many things I was thinking about trying and wanting to play. Underworld Stalkers, of course, which helps a lot against like the Kalima matchup and such like that. So there were all these different things I was thinking about, and it always just felt like I never knew what the right mix of or how to approach it. And this was just a much different approach, where you just play like, get rid of all the other discard, just play your Skull Shatter as just a really, really powerful ramp thing to ramp into in some matchups. You play your triple Darkness, and then it makes sense, like maybe you give up Bone Blades and Terror Pit because you want to play these Darkness Shield Blast blockers instead, because they support Johnny Darkseid pretty well, because that's like maybe one of the powerful ramp cards you get by going Darkness. And then I guess something like Goop Striker is just like a fine early game thing made to stave off aggressive decks, and then also pairs well with Johnny Darkseid, because you can just play it into Darkseid and then just pop off from there, right? You get a ramp 3 times in one turn. So that's one of the big plays that you want to go for with this deck. So I felt this different kind of approach, going with the blockers, which are just kind of generic defensive blasts that can just buy time against anything, right? Like they decent against Cyber Scamp, which is nice about this list compared to my Light Nature Haven deck, for example, where I just have a lot of spell triggers. Like having this approach where it's just all creature triggers is kind of nice. So at least against Cyber Scamp for sure. And then I mean, Dengorger is decent against Keeper of Laws too. So having that approach is a little different, and I think maybe it felt like it could be pretty good. But I think in practice, I just wasn't as impressed. Like I know I played this deck when all the decks dropped. I tried play testing a bunch with Lux, who was someone leading up to the tournament and during Lux B, who played in the last tournament. I was playing a ton of Kaijudo with him for like the weeks leading up to this tournament, and I asked him to help me like test or play some matchups with some of the decks that had dropped, and Unfortunately, he didn't play too many because he personally like kind of dismissed a lot of the decks that were brought, just saying they just weren't up to weren't up to his standards. I guess I don't know. It was kind of awkward. This was one where I think he felt like it was just too clunky, too awkward, and I think it's a little too weak to aggro. Honestly, like there's something to be said like when you're missing all the cheap ramp spells. I mean, your big play is like Johnny Darkseid plus one of these banish blockers, right? If you think about it, but like it's the same as just going like energize into Johnny Dark into like Mana Storm, or energize into like or Reap and Sow into Verdant Helix or whatever. You get the same thing, but the problem with the Darkseid play is it's much more disruptible, right? Like your opponent has all these bounce effects, piercings, Rusalkas, other things like that exist in the metagame, and they just keep you off of that bait or that creature that you need for your Darkseid. Um, Also, like if your blockers, if you're needing to like chump block or something, like then you can't chump block because you need it for Darkseid. It's just weird. It just ends up being kind of awkward. You can't trade off or anything with your Vile Piercers or your Ichor Spiders or Den Gorgers. You don't want to trade them off even because you need them for Darkseid. So it just ends up being this like kind of conditional ramp that's a little disruptible. And again, when all your ramp spells are the big kind of mid game ones, you can't curve your ramp as effectively. Like you can't go early ramp into the mid game spell. You can only go like mid game spell into like another mid game spell. Um, so it's just your ramp is less flexible. You can't punish your opponent for taking turns off in the same way that you can with a deck with all this like stuff like Reap and Sow and Sprouts and such. Um, there's less like bridge cards. There's no like Lyra in this deck. The Shield Blast count is a bit lower than something like the Light Nature Haven deck, the Turbo Rampy ones, with just 9 blasts, which is I think is kind of low. So I think it ends up being a little too clunky. 9 multis is maybe not ideal, especially when you're trying to like hit that 9 on 9. It can be kind of awkward if your opponent hasn't given you a bunch of cards. Ramnoth I'm not a big fan of. Earthbound though I do respect as like kind of a disruption card, honestly, like just kind of a floodgate in a sense. So I think this card is pretty decent. It's not a card I play a ton with, but do respect what it can do. Ramnoth I think it's just kind of a mediocre ramp card. Yeah, it's just too. Yeah, I'm just not a fan. I'm not a fan. I prefer something a little more instantaneously impactful than Ramnoth. But yeah, I think overall it just felt a little. Yeah, felt a little lacking against aggressive decks. I think clearly like it's decent. It's got some potency against mid-rangey stuff. Like I could see it having trouble, especially if your opponent's like playing more discard heavy stuff. I think an oversight was maybe playing Rain Cloud over Ironwool Tree. Maybe it's just because there was. It seems like there could have been Blinder Beetle Prime in this deck at some point with the 9 Enforcers, so that maybe that was a reason. But I think Ironwool Tree you kind of just need in this deck. But yeah, I mean like Darkness is really strong against a lot of mid-rangey stuff, and just having all the top end, as long as you can get there against slower decks, it should be good. I could see some issues in like Haven Mirror matches just because so much of your deck is just kind of weak and your mana doesn't come on until later, so maybe you're a step behind. Yeah, I don't know. I could see it being decent enough. Like the Coral Lock matchup was, I was kind of scared with like the Skull Shatter count and then just more of the threats and stuff. Absolute Darkness can be kind of annoying for Coral Lock at times. But in practice, like yeah, the matchup was just incredibly easy because they're just you have to draw like multiple ramp effects to be immune from discard, and then even then, like one ramp effect is still too slow. You just discard the Havens, and you can never really die. So, yeah, it seemed like an awful matchup. So, I think it's like a decent deck again, but again, I think it's a little too awkward against aggro. But still, like you're just super top end greedy heavy deck with just enough ramp to be able to punish like other kind of slower decks. So I think it's decent, but maybe a little too weak to aggressive decks for my liking. But yeah, I don't know. Decent at least. I would maybe think about changing a few things. Maybe add some more cheap ramp or something, or up the Shield Blast count a little bit potentially. Maybe lower the top end, but I'm not really sure what you want to do with that. So Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but I think the mix still not kind of right for the light dark nature approach. Not really sold on it. I think this deck is just worse at the moment than light nature. But I mean, darkness is particularly good against like something like Oath Dragons, so it has its merits for sure. But yeah, so that is the light dark nature Haven deck that was brought by Pappets, and we'll move on. All right, so jumping into the first deck from Pod 2, we have Louis. So, of course, Louis finished alongside Stents at the bottom of Pod 2 with a 1-3 record. I think Louis actually managed to take a match off of Otai, though, who is playing the Fire Dark Taksha deck, and so it was one of the two losses that Otai had, although Otai, of course, qualified out. But yeah, unfortunately, did lose to Claude, Stents, and Dark Signer. I think a couple of those matchups, though, were 3-game sets. And I remember even the match against Claude was actually quite close, I think. From what I remember, I think game 2 or 3, one of the 2 games Louis had lost. I think you could maybe argue an attack with Cyberscamp would have won him the race, and he could have maybe won that match. But it obviously kind of tricky. But yeah, overall, I mean, just taking a look at the deck list, it is very much just another good stuff deck. I think pretty much every card in the deck you could, I mean, almost certainly make a case, with the exception of maybe Raincloud Kraken and Gigahorn Charger. Pretty much every other card is something you'd include on a top 10 list of their respective civilizations. Like Finbar, Rusalka, Scamp, definitely all top 10 water cards. With Darkness, Stalker, Terrapit, Agrix, Mesmerize, all top 10 for sure. Turnip, Broodmother, both, again, top 10 cards. Laws, Blinder Beetle Prime, Arbiter, again, all top 10 cards again. Of course, Raincloud is that kind of filler card. Something, again, I'm always kind of inclined to go with the 1-mana baits, although I understand that 3,000 power is pretty good. But I do love just 1-mana. 1-mana baits, I think, are quite useful in a lot of spots. But regardless, if you do value the blocker, I think the extra 1,000 power can be kind of relevant. But anyways, again, with the exception of like Gigahorn Charger, then the multi-saves, there's so many good multi-saves, but even still, like Piercing Judgment is one of the best cards, so definitely a top 10, if not one of the best straight up multi-saves. Swordhorn for sure, and Targusher. I mean, there's lots of just good on-rate creatures, but these two in particular with their Enforcer race, again, like I said, pretty much every card in this deck is just a very high quality card. I guess the question though is if it all comes together to make a really well functioning deck, and honestly I'm not so sure. I know of course it didn't really work out too well in the tournament. I think again the matches against Dragons, I think this kind of deck you would sort of expect to be a bit unfavored versus Dragons. Of course, Blinder Beetle Prime can be quite strong. Swordhorn can be quite strong. Some of the Tempo cards, but Oath Dragons in particular, especially Dark Signer's version is a bit weaker, granted, or given the fact that it's relying on stuff like Supreme Dragon Bullshack, but whereas like a card like Awakened is very, very powerful against this deck, right? So overall, though, you'd still expect Dragons to be kind of a difficult matchup. The matchup against Stents' Dragon deck, I know that game, apparently, I didn't watch it, but apparently it was a kind of close 3-game set, so that's one where you can definitely imagine things getting out of hand when Stents' deck is rolling with all of its kind of overcharge removal effects, all that sort of stuff. You can definitely put this deck in a tricky spot, so you can definitely get outgrinded by, again, all that top-end stuff if you don't get off the ground quickly. And I guess that's the problem when you're looking at a deck that realistically, like, it only has 3 2-drop attackers, so it's not super aggressive. It has a high 3-drop count, so you're going to make some early plays. But again, you're playing a high, like, 9 multi-saves, 4 colors. That is going to cost you, right? Like, you don't have that is kind of the biggest issue with this deck and these kinds of decks is very often, I mean, you're in a spot where you're trying to play really high quality cards, as we touched on. You're trying to play high quality cards every turn, but the 4 civs, the multi civs, sometimes you miss a turn, honestly, and that really bites you because your deck is already less mana efficient than maybe some of the other more aggressive decks, right? You're trying to play one powerful card a turn, other decks are playing 2 cards a turn, or all that sort of stuff. And the other issue I see with this deck is there's not a ton of there's a ton of, again, great cards, but there's not a lot of like super high power. Like, you're not playing a ton of high impact threats. Like, Finbar is of course like a threat, and like stuff like Turnip and Laws are difficult to deal with threats. Finbar is a big finisher type card. Blinder Beetle Prime, but like when I'm thinking threats, I'm thinking more like high power, like just stuff like Beast Lord Rollcore, Anjak, that kind of Hive Queen, like just big double breakers, the fast attack type stuff. You're only playing like the 2 primes, 2 Agrics is a big finisher top end card. So I could see situations where your deck has a lot of high quality cards, has the card draw with Broodmother or Finbar, but maybe not enough like just super go over the top plays with just the 2 Agrics. You don't have anything like Lyra, Fang, that kind of stuff. So I can see that being an issue. And again, just you're not a super great aggressive deck in the sense that you're just, again, your curve's not great. Like your deck's not super mana efficient. Your deck has that clunkiness in terms of its mana base. So I can definitely see some issues and why. I mean, you could have some trouble against certain aggro decks. Those kind of evolution, more faster aggro decks, rush decks. Those kinds of decks tend to be good against the slower tempo-y kind of decks. But I mean, this deck does have a high blast count as well, 9 blasts, all of which are pretty strong. So again, you can always kind of go that route and have things go your way. So I think overall, again, like it's just high power level with the cards. I think you've got decent chances against a lot of stuff. I just don't know if it all comes together in terms of a great deck with great matchups. I'm sure it has good matchups here and there and all that sort of stuff, but yeah, like I said, overall for the tournament, I mean, he went 1-3. I mean, that match against Claude, I think, again, like I said, I think I watched the replay not too closely, so I don't really know, but it ended up coming down to a really tight racing situation in one of the games, I think, and if Louis had just broken one shield earlier when he had the chance with a Cyber Scamp on an empty board, I think he could have won that race because Claude's deck has no shield blast, so that was like one maybe mistake, but at the same time, that attack does kind of take the game in a different direction from there, and it's a little ambiguous as to how it plays out differently, so I can't really say for sure, but yeah, against the aggressive decks with the high blast count, with the ability to have some speed in reversing the board state with stuff like Prime and even Piercings and such, taking advantage of that with your high power creatures like Swordhorn and board control-y stuff like Targrusher. So, I mean, you got stuff for every matchup. You have your anti-control package with Scamp, Turnip, Laws. I just think there is a bit of again, it all kinds of stems down to a little bit of the clunkiness. You are playing with a little bit of fire where some games your deck's just not gonna produce it's gonna produce some unfunctional draws, I guess, or non-functional draws. So I think there is some trickiness to it, but overall I think it's still a fairly decent deck. But yeah, it would definitely have some issues, but yeah, I think again, could have easily gone. I think the maybe the match against Sense was quite close, so I mean, could have easily had maybe anywhere from like the 1-3 to the 3-1, 3-1 record. I think you could see any of those results kind of coming through. Unfortunately, finished on the quite the low end, but I guess it is what it is. I don't know exactly what I'd change again. These kinds of decks, like you could go a million different directions. I guess like Gigahorn Charger, I'm not super big on personally. I don't really like it. Gets you to your Agrics, but I feel like you could maybe just cut the card. I don't know if you probably need the mana. I guess that's one shortcoming of this deck is you don't have very consistent mana for your Swordhorn turn 3 or your Turnip turn 3, so that is another issue, I guess. Only 10 mana, so yeah, some of the consistency is a little low, but same goes for turn 2 Scamp. So yeah, there are definitely some shortcomings, definitely some clunkiness, but if things line up the right way, you just play good cards every turn and win. But I just think a lot of the time you just either get outpaced or you just brick or just miss that play too much. Like that's kind of the issue. I even have that issue playing like decks like Mega Bugs often, like even just 3-color tempos with higher curves a lot, and just trying to play a powerful card every turn. You just get outpaced, or against control matchups, like you're supposed to be good, but at the same time, sometimes you just like draw mediocre and your deck just bricks on a multi-civ, or you just have to take turns off for because your deck kind of screws you over. And I think that you're taking on even more risk with an approach like this. Like I think just honestly just going towards just straight light water nature might just be a more effective approach, where you just like you don't have to play Mega Bugs. You can just go harder on the Enforcers, maybe throw in some Lyras, maybe not. Just play just some more. You can go Mega Bugless, kind of just light water nature, good stuff, tempo deck. I think that might be better than just taking on all this extra risk. I mean, heck, you could even splash Terra Pits if you really value an extra powerful Shield Blast answer removal type effect if you really want to, because I don't know if you get that much mileage out of having just the random, like Targusher's decent, but you can maybe easily fix that up with, or replace that with a different kind of Enforcer or something, some other early drop. So yeah, I think overall I just feel like this kind of deck just takes on a little bit too much inconsistency for it to really be worth it, but it's still a totally fine deck. Alright, so the next deck from Pod 2, we are looking at Stents the Boss's Water, Fire, Nature, I guess Fight Dragons. So, of course, looking at the deck, one of the key themes here is Krogon, I guess, just a bunch of dragons and a lot of kind of removal based effects where you can just kind of attack your opponent's board down. So stuff like Chain Lash, Morna, Krogon itself, you've got, and then I guess Stents the Boss is one of his favorite cards is pet cards Overcharge. So I know this one is something I think he has played it in a number of decks, just one of his pet cards. So key themes are, of course, as we touched on, just try to control your opponent's board with basically Krogon when you just build a giant board of dragons and just remove everything. And then you have Lepidos as a way to just kind of get rid of your opponent's shields when you're starting to make going for game a lot easier. So those are kind of the late game themes. And then you have some early game stuff to kind of bridge you over there with, I guess, some deterrent type attackers, stuff like Cyberwalker Kaylee, which does a good job just either trading into or just managing all of your opponent's small creatures that might be trying to get aggressive with you. You can just easily come down, answer them, and then it sticks in board to kind of make it hard for your opponent to attack with future cheap creatures. And then Weaponized Razorcat, of course, is another high-powered creature for the early game, and then gives you something else that can another also high-powered creature that can be paired with stuff like Overcharge to remove your opponent's stuff. Then you have some utility stuff like Rusalka, and then if you are just kind of sitting there with your Mornas and Krogons managing your opponent's board, you can kind of just churn through your deck by just putting out a Muktak as kind of a card draw engine. And then other stuff like Finbar is another kind of card draw engine. And then, of course, you just complement it with some Shield Blasts. I guess Ice Blades is just a cheap spell to just kind of buy some time in the early game. And then you also have, of course, some other more high impact Shield Blasts like Ritual Challenge, of course, conditional, but another reason why it's nice to have a Weaponized Razorcat going up to 7k. You can answer those if your opponent's coming at you with any of those kind of level 4 6k type double breakers, charging Great Claws, Prism Blade Ascendants, that kind of stuff. I mean, with Weaponized Razorcat, it gives you a lot of reach lets you cover a lot of ground in terms of what you can answer with Ritual Challenge. And then, of course, powerful stuff like Tendril Grasp, which can even ramp you if you kind of have these deterrents out, and then at some point you can just turn them into mana. That it can be pretty powerful as well, even though you're sacrificing board state. Ideally, you're answering your opponent's board, and then you can leverage that extra mana better than they can with starting to dump out some of these high-power creatures. And, of course, Sumo Artichoke, another just really powerful card, and also gives you a way to just pair it well with, again, overcharge type effects when you can... it also works nicely with something like General Sky Crusher, where it can kind of come down as a Shield Blast and then has a lot more reach in terms of what it can attack over on the crackback potentially. I know maybe that's a little bit of wishful thinking sometimes. Normally maybe it's just there to keep you alive, of course, but has some utility there as well, a little more effective than in other decks in terms of what it can offer as a creature in play. But yeah, overall, I think this deck again also finished 1-3 alongside Louis. I think the only match that since won was against Louis, a 2-1 match. But I think he played some other close matches as well against both maybe Dark Signer and Otai. I think both of those went to 3 games as well, which I would kind of expect from this deck. Like, I think when things go smoothly, you can definitely reach some positions where, like in the Oath Dragons matchup against Dark Signer, for example. I mean, Oath Dragons doesn't really have a ton of hard answer cards, right? It's a lot of like combat battling for board. If you're getting into like these kind of stalematey positions, like this deck kind of has an edge with stuff like Krogon and all these other mid-rangey dragon cards, overcharge effects. Like of course Oath Dragons would have stuff like Piercing, Storm Spark to kind of break boards, Lyra, tap effects as well. But you're just kind of battling for position, and this deck has a lot of the same stuff. And if a Krogon gets out of hand, the only creatures that are really bigger than that in Oath Dragons would be the 9-drops, and so unless you're just tempoing them out with like Lyra effects and stuff, but it can just get out of hand, especially when you mix in stuff like Steam Tank. But overall, like in that Oath Dragon type matchup, the problem is this deck's early game. I mean, it's just kind of non-existent against an Oath Dragon deck. Like if you're afraid of Herald, like most of the cheap creatures are not really castable. And then like Nyx is the only way to kind of accelerate your game plan. So for the most part, you're just kind of just like you might Ice Blades and take a minus to bounce a dragon, or to bounce one of the Oath Dragon's birds. But overall, I mean, you're really kind of draw passing till turn 5 basically almost every game. So you don't really make many plays, and as long as Oath Dragon gets off the ground to any degree, they can kind of just snowball the game, especially if they draw birds. I feel like you'd kind of end up somewhat hooped. So I could see like that maybe that's the type of matchup you'd expect to maybe go like 0-2 or 1-2 against, where maybe you have one game where things go your way, but for the most part your deck's just going to be a little too slow and kind of come out behind. And against aggro matchups, I know against like Otai playing the Taksha deck, I mean, Tendril Grasp is of course great. Timely shield triggers can definitely just kind of win things, but the problem is that this deck doesn't, like, it has 4. I mean, a lot of these triggers are kind of like Ritual of Challenge is dependent on stuff, and at times it can be really strong, sometimes it might be dead. Ideally not though. Like ideally it should be a decent Shield Blast. Bottle of course can do bodily things, not as high impact as decks playing of course like piles of Havens and Andromedas and all that sort of stuff, but still kind of an effective Shield Blast. But I mean, Ice Blades is just a speed bump, so you're really leaning hard on some of your Shield Blasts to really make up ground against aggressive decks. I think because this deck can be quite clunky, stuff like Kaylee is honestly not. I just don't find Kaylee to be quite a good card, a very good card at all, to be honest. Like it can serve as that deterrent, it can serve as just a way to revenge kill some stuff, but for the most part, like especially when your deck can't really punish your opponent taking their time as well, like of course like you'd aim for a Herald, but then you get to the problem where this deck can't really do a good job forcing through its Heralds. It doesn't have jump jets and it doesn't have Osorn Call, so like when you lack those kinds of tools, you end up in spots where aggressive decks can just bounce the Herald of Infernus with any of their numerous bounce effects, or just you're playing out your Herald into tap removal, that kind of stuff. So your opponent can afford to play maybe a little more passively, build boards, and just kind of exploit this kind of deck. They don't have to just run into your shield triggers immediately. They don't have to play into your Razor Cats and Kaylee's immediately. So I think the deck being a bit too clunky, I think it just lacks a little bit of like opening speed. Not having any kind of ramp, I think, is puts a lot of pressure on drawing Nyx. Not having like card draw and such as well puts a lot of pressure on Nyx too. So you end up being quite weak to discard. So I think there's a lot of kind of flaws in the deck. Not enough like maybe high impact Shield Blasts. But if you do get off the ground, if your opponent stumbles, then you can kind of just snowball board advantage really quickly by just, with stuff like Krogon, Morna, just managing the board. If you get off your Herald, then you are in a pretty good spot to just kind of take over. Stuff like Overcharge can definitely blow out an opponent that's stumbling, right? If you play your weaponized Razor Cat, you play something else, and then Overcharge to clear 2 to 3 creatures, I mean, you're in a very good spot. But at the same time, like, you are just, without that card draw, you are just kind of playing to, both of you and your opponent are going to be kind of drawing out of it, and you have to have some speed to kind of close the game as well, which I guess is what the Finbar's for. That gives you a good way to just kind of capitalize. So when you have just like answered your opponent's board, if you have any measly board of your own, you can just drop the Finbar and then just kind of take advantage. And so I guess that's the kind of one of the main plans you'll go for if you're not playing maybe the slower, just kind of build the dragon kind of engine type game. So I can kind of see how it all fits together to somewhat. I think, yeah, just being a bit heavy on cards. I don't know if it just has enough high impact early game stuff. I don't know if it has enough great shield blasts. I don't know exactly how the mix. I just feel like it's a little too clunky in its current form. I don't, but yeah, I don't know. It just stuff like Lepidos, I just don't think it makes more sense in this kind of deck, but it is somewhat basically win more for the most part. I don't know if you ever like really. Yeah, I mean, maybe it could happen. Like, it could be somewhat. It could come in relevant. Like, if you just hit 1 to 2 shields off with it, maybe that like lets you pick off a couple things, which lowers your risk going into a late game. But I don't know. I don't really see it, to be honest. So yeah, overall, I mean, I think it's a pretty unpolished list, but I mean, the Fight Dragon type stuff, maybe at the end of the day it is sort of suboptimal. I mean, it's not even really a dragon deck in the same way as other dragon decks. Like, you're playing 3 birds. I mean, it is a dragon deck, but yeah, I don't know. I think like the Fight Dragon stuff, it is a different kind of approach to things, trying to take advantage of different stuff, different cards, really mainly focused on Krogon. Which is a powerful card, but yeah, I think overall as a deck, definitely needs a little bit more refinement to get to maybe a more consistent place, I suppose. But still, just like some decent stuff, capable of decent draws. You're just kind of probably an underdog in most games and looking to kind of have things go your way to actually win games. But that kind of stuff is always possible, so not the worst thing. But yeah, that is the Water, Fire, Nature deck. So we'll move on to the last of the decks that did not qualify for the top 4. Alright, so next up we have the Oath Dragons list brought by Darksigner. So of course, played to a 2-2 record, but unfortunately lost out on tie breaks due to actually losing to Otai. So Otai also finishing 2-2 made it out of the pod. But yeah, so Darksigner playing Oath Dragons. Of course, his build is the one he plays, I guess, in person, or the one he has with his actual IRL cards. So that is where you see the Supreme Dragon Bullshack as kind of the budget alternative to the other 9-drop dragons like Infernus and Andromeda. I think in place, typically, I know he said he would probably use like 2 Awaken, 2 Andromeda instead of the Bullshack plus Sargon, but the rest of it is all just kind of similar stuff to what we've seen with other Oath Dragon builds. There are a few things that I think Darksigner's done a little bit differently, but yeah, so I guess jumping in, most of the stuff, like I said, is kind of the same. You have 3 Keeper of Laws. I know sometimes that's something that gets trimmed. I think some of the interesting thing is cutting a Piercing Judgment to lower the multi-civ count, I guess especially because you're adding that Overlord Sargon. Going up to 2 Stormspark, 2 Stormspark. I think anywhere from 1 to 3. I've been kind of shaving and playing 1, but I usually feel a little uncomfortable doing so. But yeah, some number of Stormsparks. Another interesting thing is playing the 2nd Jump Jets. I know I did that in I think the first list I played, I had 3 Oathsworn, 2 Jump Jets. I think you can get away with just one, but it is a decent fire mana as well, so it's something to be somewhat desired, and it is a good card for forcing your Herald through, but I feel like it's a bit less necessary to have it multiple copies when you have the Oathsworns, but because it does lead to a little more of the bricky kind of hands. But again, being a fire mana is alleviates some of that brickiness in a sense. But yeah, overall, just also the suite of one of dragons. So of course, when you're playing Bullshack, it makes the general Sky Crusher more desirable. I know this is a card that I've been cutting from a lot of lists in favor of Twin Cannon, just to give you more game against some of the low to the ground kind of aggressive Evo decks. I view it as kind of like part of this like kind of almost a combo package with the Oathsworn Call, whether you can drop the Herald or you drop the Herald and then you kind of add in the Twin Cannon. Obviously, it's a lot of cards, right? You're mixing Herald plus Oath plus Twin Cannon Maelstrom plus like your 9-drop Dragon. So it is a bit more heavy, but I think without the Maelstroms, it becomes a lot harder to beat those kind of Taksha, Conflagration, any of those Evo-based like kind of aggressive decks. Like Twin Cannon Maelstrom was just really crucial as that cheaper card. Compared to something like Sky Crusher, which was just always a little too expensive, but Sky Crusher is a little more powerful against like the slower tempos and like the more other mid-range matchups. It could be more powerful definitely if you're playing like the Dragon Mirror, for example, but then at the same time I do like also just having a higher 5-drop dragon count, just because it gives you more follow-ups to Nyx, more 4-drop plays. Which is kind of desirable. Like if you don't have laws to follow up a bird, it just gives you more ways to just kind of play that kind of Magris type, like 4-mana draw card when it enters type creature. But hyperspeed again, one of pretty powerful as a one of, a little weaker in this deck when you're not dropping awakens, because of course Supreme Dragon already has fast attack, but at the same time it is a fast attack that you can summon off of a Supreme Dragon when it's targeted, as long as you kind of are maintaining another armor dragon in play. So still has utility there. The Sargon, it's obviously the cute card that you can't cast, but you can get it off of Bullshack's effect, kind of, whereas Hyperspeed is sort of a conditional speed attacker, right? You need to also have like a Herald out. If they're like just terrapitting your Supreme Dragon, you still need another armor dragon in play to actually let this attack. But Sargon is just always going to have fast attack. But it is obviously like another multi-save in a deck that where multi-saves are particularly harmful, and you do make the accommodation for powerful cards like Piercing and Oathsworn, but for the most part, like trying to keep the multi-count low in Dragons is ideal. Obviously, like you can usually play your multi-saves within the first couple turns, like if you draw Lux into Nyx, but sometimes you can afford to play Lux on turn 3 into a turn 4 dragon. But for the most part, like Dragons is a deck that wants to curve like 3, 4, 5, 6. So you don't have many turns to play that multi-civ mana, so you can kind of get bricked on those pretty heavily, and that can kind of cost you. So overall, I mean, it is quite a downgrade playing Bullshack. It's a decent card for sure. Like it's powerful top end, resilient kind of threat, but it is just much weaker because it's kind of like a lot of the aim of these Oath Dragons builds are to play that kind of combo, anti-aggro combo game where you're dropping Awakens, Andromedas, and just winning the game on the spot with those, like locking your opponent out, just regenerating shields, just doing that kind of thing. And with Supreme Dragon Bullshack, it doesn't really, like, sometimes it can stabilize a board just attacking over whatever your opponent attack with or whatever, just having a big body to fast attack, just come down and clear something. But it's not the same kind of just game-ending bomb in the same sense as those other cards. And a lot of the time, like if you're up against it, especially with Coral, setting your Oathsworn Call, like Last Shield or Oathsworn Call, like Last Shield, Oathsworn, and Oath Dragons can still be game winning, right? You just drop your Herald, maybe they can't attack anymore, you attack over something, drop the Andromeda, whatever, right? But with Bullshack, you're not doing the same kind of thing. Maybe you're forced into just attacking your opponent and trying to close out the game that way, and a lot of the time you'll just lose to a Shield Blast when you have to just kind of flip, when all you can do is race with your big top end cards. So it's less effective in that sense. You could also just get it chump blocked by some residual block that your opponent has out, and it kind of is ineffectual completely ineffectual. So it is just definitely a downgrade because again the whole philosophy of this deck kind of stems from cheating in these big powerful dragons, and when you downgrade the big powerful dragons, a lot of that support system is kind of weakened in a sense that it's just less like the risk reward on a card like Oathsworn Call. It becomes harder to kind of stomach that when the reward's not as high, basically. So it is definitely a downgrade to the deck. But I mean, looking when I mean, I think I reviewed or watched some of the replays that Darksteiner had. I think I saw both matches that he lost, and I don't think the top end had anything to really do with it. It was just he did lose to both of the evolution aggressive decks. The Taksha deck, which if the Taksha deck just draws Taksha, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the cards in the deck are. You just kind of draw Taksha, and if it changes into another threat, whether it's an evolution or just like even something as simple as like a Wildfire Valkyrie, very difficult to answer a lot of the time if it comes down early enough. So you kind of hooped if that happened, and it happened twice, I think. So you kind of lose that match. And then against Claude's deck, just Neuron and Palada, those evolutions are also very, very tricky to deal with, and I think that's where something like Maelstrom is very, very important for that matchup to have a chance. I think overall for Oath Dragon's deck, if you are on a higher Maelstrom count, it is. I don't know if it's a unfavored matchup. It's kind of hard for me to say. I played it a little bit against like Claude's deck in particular, and I felt like Oath Dragons is probably around at least 50-50. Maybe a bit less. It's maybe a bit high variance, but I think overall, a lot of it does hinge on having Oathsworn and Shields or some clunkier draws from the water deck. But a big part of it is definitely the Maelstrom being able to counter those evolutions with different ways your board can be set up. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think most of the stuff is kind of makes sense. I guess the one other thing is like the third Corile. I know Darksigner is a bit higher on this. Personally, I'm still not sure if like anywhere from 0 to 3 is good. It's one of those things where, I mean, it's kind of funny because Corile, when I was looking at some of the deck stats and card stats, like looking at what were the most winning cards in our tournament so far, like you look at the winning deck list, which cards have had the most copies represented, and I think Corile was like top 5 or something because it's been used in all sorts of different decks, whether like the Oath Dragons builds that have done well, winning tournaments. I think Raijinku's Shield Blast deck. I think Darksigner had a light water aggro deck. So Corile has just been randomly just heavily represented, which is, I think it's probably the most overused, or it's the least deserving of any card I think on that top list. So I don't know. I'm still not sure if it's great. I think it's okay. It's just I initially added it to the deck as kind of just a smoothing kind of hedge card, give you another cheap creature, something that can set up those shields a little bit, and then also just maybe filter card draws, gives you another attacker for your Finbar Laws draws. So that was kind of why I initially added. I still like the value of a card like Logo Scan in certain matchups, but I think those last few slots with Dragons are always up for debate. But yeah, overall, I'm still not sold on it. Of course, you want that dynamic of like having the mix up of Stormspark and Oathsworn Call is really nice. Of course, like the idea there, if you have high impact shields that your opponent can't afford to break right away, like Oathsworn Call, it improves the power of setting Stormspark, because if the only Shield Blast in your deck were Stormspark, your opponent could just play with that in mind and just easily find opportunities. Like if you have 2 attackers, you attack with one, then you attack and break the Stormspark. It's kind of obvious, right? And then you just force it out. So setting Stormsparks with the Corile effect becomes pretty weak and ineffectual when your opponent can afford to just kind of play around it. But as soon as you introduce cards like Oathsworn Call, where now if they want to take that approach, like they force out the Stormspark on an earlier turn, now all of a sudden you're getting wombo comboed by a Herald of Infernus, right? So because of that risk, you're kind of forced to much more often like leave that set shield for last, which of course last shield Stormspark is the best place for Stormspark for the most part, right? So it improves that. So having that dynamic is really nice, but I think it's not as effective in this kind of deck in particular, because again, it's less of a racing deck. Now, maybe this list does have to race more often than maybe Oath Dragons, which can again play for those kind of just lock game states for, in a sense, where just a lot of matchups you can straight up lock your opponent with an Inverness, or just like completely invalidate whatever they're doing with an Andromeda. So you're playing less for those kind of just like complete board domination wins, perhaps. And you are a bit more of a racing deck, but again, just like the last shield, it's not like you're a full-on aggro deck that's just beating face, and then you can just leverage the last shield or Storm Spark Blast. Like, you are a slower, clunkier deck. You build your board slowly, so it is a bit less effective than like a more dedicated, aggressive deck that's setting like in Duel Masters, where you're setting like Surfers and Storm Sparks, like Alzonius, for example. It's a more aggressive deck that's taking a much more aggressive stance, and that mix-up is a little more powerful because your last shield Storm Sparks are a little more powerful in those aggro mirrors. So not quite to the same effect, but still effective for sure. But a lot of the time it's more about like, do you have the cards to answer like the big threat your opponent's hitting you over the head with or not? And Oath Dragons, like, you can buy a turn with Storm Spark, but you don't really have the hard answers to anyways. Like, so, but it's still good for like if your opponent's just, you just have no choice but to drop a Herald and let your opponent stare at it. They attack into the Storm Spark, and then, but again, that's where we get back to one of the other weaknesses. Again, it is just, you're forced, when you're in that position, you're forced to kind of just race with, you're dropping a Bullshack or something rather than actually being able to just win the game on the spot with an Andromeda or something. So yeah, I don't know. So overall, I think decent list, pretty so far straightforward. Pretty, like, if you just sub out the Supreme Dragon and the Overlord Sargon, you have a pretty straightforward Oath Dragon build. Again, you could debate the last few slots, but I think for the most part, pretty similar to what's been used by Andros and I in past tournaments. But yeah, so like I said, I think he lost to both of the evolution-based aggressive decks, where he definitely did not draw particularly well. I don't think he had Oathsworn Call either game against Claude, and just kind of got rolled over, which is going to happen. That's just the game you play with this deck. It is kind of just check your shields a lot of the time. And then against Otai, I know he went to, I think, 3 games, and Otai just, I mean, he had the Taksha stuff. So when you have the Taksha, it's very difficult to answer if you don't have like specifically Oathsworn plus like Maelstrom with like Herald. So yeah, that's how it goes. The other matches, I think Louis' deck seems like a bit of an easier matchup for Dragons, and doesn't have a ton of blockers to really answer to really stall out something like a Supreme Dragon Bullshack if it comes down. Lots of his stuff targets, which is pretty rough. So that could be tricky. And then against Stence's deck, I think this deck is just gets off the ground a little bit quicker, can just get through its stuff, maybe get to a Finbar first and just kind of go in, and Herald renders a lot of stuff really risky from Stence, which slows him down even more. So yeah, I could see that matchup being kind of dependent, but then of course if this deck just doesn't get off the ground with its like more consistent early game, then Stence's deck can maybe take over with its just higher level top end, I guess. So yeah, overall went 2-2, but fairly close. I think one match different, you're 3-1. So these things are kind of all over the place in terms of results and stuff. But yeah, decent deck overall. Overall, I think, like, I know Oathsworn deck Oath Dragons gets talked about as maybe the best deck in the game or something by some of the people. I really don't know if I agree with that. I think it's just another decent deck that's got some decent matchups, some bad matchups. I think the margins between everything are, like, it's just too much about like what the field is to really say like a best deck on average. Especially, like, I don't really know like what even is the real metagame supposed to be. If everyone was like super tryharding, it's hard to say. And like, maybe this is the best deck in that kind of world. I don't really even know if that would be the case. So generally a fairly decent deck into these kinds of fields at the very least. So but yeah, of course, that is the Oath Dragons deck brought by Darksigner. So after this, I'll move on and start to talk about the decks that made top 4. All right, so kicking off the top 4 decks, first up in 4th place, we have Otai's Fire Dark Taksha list. So obviously, we've had Dark Signer in past events. I think it's been shown in a couple that he had done pretty well with his own build of Taksha. And Otai's list here is pretty clearly a much different approach. I think both Dark Signer and Otai have kind of approached the archetype with fairly different philosophies. But before I kind of get into the list, to just talk about his run, I think Otai finished 2-2 in the pod, beating, I believe, Stents and Dark Signer, and then losing to Louis and the winner of the pod Claude Alpha. And because he had the tiebreak on Dark Signer beating him in that pod, he ended up making out. So he advanced to top 4 with a 2-2 record, and then unfortunately lost in the top 4 to the eventual winner Caleb. And then I managed to beat Otai in the fourth playoff match. So I ended up total going 2-4. So maybe not the best record overall. Granted, I think 3 of his 4 losses were some closer 2-1 matches. I think all of his losses, except the one to me, I think maybe I was his most convincing loss. But all of them, I think, were pretty tight matches with this deck, which I think is kind of the nature of this build. So yeah, getting into the deck list choices. So comparing it to Dark Signer's list again, if you want to check that out, I think it was featured in the last tournament report video, I believe. But yeah, so this one is quite a bit different. So Dark Signer's build was much more linear, focus more heavily on just Taksha and Torhelm specifically, just the 3 or 6 copies of those evolutions. And then just a lot more in the way of 1 mana bait with Jet Flame Bodyguards, Gigabolvers, Marrow Ooze. So Otai opting for less 1-drops, only 2 Blaze Belchers, playing Skeleton Soldier, which is a creature that can attack. Of course, Dark Signer was including the Gigabolvers and Marrow Ooze because those options can attack. There is a lot of stuff that kind of targets one case in the game, stuff like Scrap Heap Hunter, for example, Drillstorm, cards like that. Maybe in a deck like this, you would still prefer to have a card like Marrow Ooze that can attack. I'm not super sure. Maybe it is better to have Skeleton Soldier over something like Gigabolver, though, just an extra card to protect your evolutions, help with racing, unlike something like a Sledge Bot, which is a little bit doesn't protect your shields. But again, the differences are pretty clear. Dark Signer's deck, a bit lower curve. Stuff like Time Lost Phantom is an extra attacking 2-drop. Not so many, and very little in the way of these defensive options, whereas Otai has taken a different approach where he's kind of rounded out the deck with a giant suite of different kind of options. So seeing stuff like the suite of random kind of removal spells, a smattering of different stuff with Comets, Bone Blades, Soul Vortex, playing a more powerful evolution or I guess a more high impact evolution, obviously. With Restless Conflagration compared to something like Torhelm. I think Torhelm is maybe a card you still want to play. I think that's something most people think is a really powerful card in the game, which it is. I think Torhelm is quite strong. But Restless Conflagration has also impressed me out of this deck. Obviously, I think it's a very strong card in general. I think most people are on board with that. And yeah, it's been very interesting to see, and I've played a lot with both builds actually, both Dark Signer and Otai's build. I've actually played a number of games with, and I think Otai's build is one. I'll just say it looks worse, but it definitely plays better than it looks, and I think there's some lessons to learn from that. Where again, Dark Signer's build is very linear, focused on just getting out Taksha, and just that redundancy, just linear redundancy. Whereas again, Otai's list, you have a bit less consistency in terms of getting out those cheap evolutions, getting out ahead with the disruptive Torhelm. Obviously, Torhelm is much less of a focus in this list with only the 5 fire baits and just 1 Torhelm compared to Dark Signer's 9 and 3, right? And then Taksha, you can still do with the 8 1-drops. You can still if you open Taksha, you can still perform some turn 3 Takshas sometimes, but it's much less consistent than a deck like Dark Signer's. But you're kind of making up for that, sort of getting back to some of the ideas I talked about at the beginning with going over Boingus's list, is just having these defensive options. They kind of raise the floor in different ways, maybe not directly with your draw consistency, but just in the ability to play interactive longer games going back and forth, because you have this mix of defensive options. And again, Kaijudo is a game that allows you to play these kind of this smattering of situational or just different tools. And I think that's, again, Darksigner's deck, it is somewhat exploitable in the sense that there aren't a very wide variety of cards in the deck. There's not a ton of tools. Again, it's just very much redundant and focusing on those evolutions, whereas Otai's deck, for example, it has more consistent outs to something like Gloomhollow. So for example, last tournament when I built the mono dark deck for Gareth, I knew that matchup was just incredibly favored against Fire Dark Taksha from Darksigner, just kind of predicting Darksigner would be on that deck. I mean, Gloomhollow just completely shuts the deck down. Obviously, you have counterplay if you can stick a Taksha and then combine it with stuff like Fire Chick or Ember Adept or even Mesmerize. But for the most part, Gloomhollow was very, very difficult to deal with. And then all these other cards like the removal spells and such, just having less interactive spells, you were just really cold to a lot of stuff. And having no defensive blasts made it very easy to play against. So the mix of just defensive blasts and just the mix of interaction. And I think what Taksha does really well, because again, another point that I had made earlier is that sort of just having a bit of all of these different tools, mixing it in, kind of messing up some draw consistency, but adding just more tools and varieties and options and all that sort of stuff, maybe raising the floor on your shield zone or improving the impact of your shield zone, trying to high roll with good draws plus good shields, all that stuff I had talked about. I think, again, I mentioned that you kind of need to, for that approach to really be worth it, you kind of need to evaluate it with the actual deck that you're building and how that approach fits compared to something like a consistent approach. And I think Taksha is a deck that can benefit from both. I think it really depends kind of what decks you're trying to target. And I think there is actually a lot of merit to this kind of approach with Taksha because, again, Kaijudo itself is a forgiving game when you're making those kinds of card choices compared to other games. Like, you're allowed to play some awkward cards. And then Taksha takes that to another degree because you have all this filtering stuff. Stuff like Ember Adept, Mischievous Fire Chick, and Taksha itself allow you the ability to play some bad cards and get away with it even more so. So that's something to be said. Now, granted, I think both decks, maybe Otai's deck is a little bit better at top decking than Darksigner's, but so that's kind of one of the things is you might think like one of the problems with this approach is you're playing a rush deck with way too many reactive defensive cards, and like if they answer your pressure, then you're just top decking dead stuff. But you could say similar stuff about Darksigner's deck, where if you answer the cards that matter, it's a lot of support for Taksha, even though Darksigner's build is a little more focused on just being a rush deck. And then of course we have Bako that kind of serves as a backup plan. Although Bako has rarely impressed me, I think it's kind of a multi-brick, and I don't really know if it's worth it. There are some spots, like if you can follow up a Fire Chick on an empty board, there are spots where it does perform decently well at putting on some pressure. But a lot of the time when I was testing this deck, I didn't really feel that Bako was a particularly strong performer. I think it's a card that could go. I mean, if you're really concerned about like playing to the meta game that we've had from this tournament, for example, if you're like expecting decks like Coral Lock or even the deck that Caleb won with, all these, I mean, Icar Spider was the most represented card this tournament, funnily enough, I think with 12 copies across 10 decks. A card like Krakus, the Dominator, something that, I mean, historically I've never really liked that card, but I think it would have been a well-positioned card in this tournament, for example. And that's something you could look at if you're playing this more like kind of interactive approach, where you have this variety of different game plans you can go for. I think that might be a more impactful card than Bako at the very least, because I felt like having the multi-civs, all the high count, even with the card filtering, a lot of the time you had awkward draws where you're trying to filter out those multi-civs after leading on one turn one, and then if you have to charge a multi-turn one, it definitely ruins your ability to play a Taksha easily if you're trying to go for like a turn 1 drop into 2-drop plus, or into 2-drop, and then 1-drop plus Taksha. Those hands are a lot harder to pull off, so then you have to kind of compromise and maybe evolve on your 2-drop, which maybe you don't want to have to do. So I think ditching the Bakos, it is kind of a backup plan, but all the card has been felt unimpressive. I think, again, like I mentioned, Restless Conflagration is something that's really impressive. I think honestly that could be a card that even in Darkshiner's build you might want to find like one or two copies, room for one or two copies. Honestly, like just having another evolution that can take advantage of those like all the 1 mana baits that are flying around in that deck. I think Conflagration could be a nice choice again, a nice answer to Gloomhollow. But yeah, the shield triggers, they add some stuff to the deck as well, just having more defensive triggers. I guess one of the issues you could point out is that most of the stuff targets, it's easier to play around because there's not universal answers like Terror Pit. Like the universal answer is a card like Ichor Spider, which can block everything, but the rest of it is fairly it's fairly targeted, right? Scrappy Punter and Soul Vortex, you're not targeting too much in the way of threats. Very limited. Bone Blades, of course, level 4 or less. The Comet Missile, it's nice to have a cheap, efficient answer for something like Gloomhollow, which I know is the reason Otai ended up putting this card in the deck in the first place after I think we had played some test matches previously when I was on some Gloomhollow decks. But yeah, I think overall most of the cards, I'm not a super big fan of Soul Vortex. It's a pretty powerful shield blast, honestly. Like if your opponent it's kind of situational at the same time. It is very situational, but there are a lot of times where it is if you're forced to break shields against this deck, it can be one of the things you're most afraid of, because obviously like they get back some threat, like especially one of these Evos or something. It could be scary, right? They answer a blocker, and then like especially in racing situations, it can be very scary because it sets up the reversal play for next turn for them while also answering something on your board. So it's been scary, but it is kind of a clunky card. Bone Blades is just always kind of fine, and it's one of those, if you're going to play some removal spells, it's probably the one you want. Comet Missile, again, adds a little bit of efficiency for dealing with some of the problems. Yeah, I think the only card that feels a lot like just like complete dead weight when have been playing these lists is Spectre Claw. I just don't think it does much. Like obviously the idea is it kind of functions as a speed attacker for 2 mana with Bacco out. You can just buff it's a pump spell / extra shield break when you for only 2 mana, which can be nice. But I think you can just do better than this. Yeah, you can just have higher standards than a card like this. It's just not. I don't think it's doing anything that's particularly necessary, and I think you could get like it's not an awful, like it has uses. It's not an awful card, but I think your standards can be higher than this, and you can get a little more mileage out of those 2 slots. Like I said, I haven't been the most impressed by Bacco. It's been very kind of inconsistent in how it performs. There's often a lot more spots where it's detrimental, but at the same time, it can also, if it goes unchallenged in certain board states, it can definitely run away with things and put on some extra pressure. And it does help as that kind of buff, like having the kind of pump effect, just the power attack to attack over some stuff can be relevant. So it's not the worst thing, but I think you could also entertain some different options. I don't think it's a mandatory card. Something like Scrappy Hunter, again, maybe not a mandatory card. It's pretty decent, nice little cheap play / shield blast, and then there's a lot of 1Ks running around. You could play the 3rd Blaze Belcher. Yeah, I mean, I don't hate the idea. I know it looks kind of awkward, but I don't hate the idea of moving a bit away from Blaze Belcher because this deck has a bit of a weirder playstyle than just like a rush deck. But more 1-drop baits is probably appreciated. But yeah, overall, I think the approach, it looks like a little bit of a mess, this deck list. I'm not going to lie. Like, I think I said that already. But it definitely does play a bit better than it looks. And I think that lesson is just, I mean, it's the way Kaijudo kind of works in terms of deck building with these aggro decks, where you just have a lot of like flexibility and just that mix of defensive card and speed and some high impact threats and such. And then the filtering from Taksha also affords you the ability. You don't have to play like Darkshiner's build, again, much more linear, much more redundant, and is focused on kind of chaining those evolutions together. This build is more about just kind of adapting to the board state, just digging for answers or just lining your plays up the way you want to, just filtering through cards. You're taking more advantage out of the card filtering rather than just the card draw itself. So it is a bit of a different approach, and I think it works both ways. There are definitely, advantages, I think. This one is a little bit, can be more tricky to play against for certain matchups, but at the same time, against certain kinds of control decks, against certain kinds of mid-range decks like Oath Dragons, for example, this does just function as a less consistent version of Darksider's deck, in my opinion. You're just a bit slower. It's a little more high variance. You're less consistent at executing the kinds of plans. But at the same time, I mean, you kind of saw it in the tournament, watching the match between Otai and Darksider. I mean, Otai just had the Taksha hands 2 of the 3 games, and if you have those hands, like you just draw your 1-drops in Taksha, it doesn't really matter what the rest of your deck is. The whole thing is just this deck is less consistent at doing that. So you are just losing percentage points, but your ability to do the things that win in those matchups is still there in your deck, right? So you're capable of it, but you're giving up percentage points in those matchups, which are the good matchups for Taksha. I think the kind of the matchups you're targeting, you're giving that up to have more play in a variety of other things. So again, overall, I think the deck is decent. Otai finished 4th place, maybe not the best performance overall, going 2 and 4, but to make it out of the group was nice. And then unfortunately a couple losses in the actual top 4 stage, but still a decent approach. And again, like I said, I've played actually a fair amount with some of the Otai's deck lists, and I think they've been performing pretty decently overall, to be honest. So pretty decent, and nice to see some different approaches and get a feel for the different things. But I there are always stuff you can change at the same time. So that was the first of the top 4 decks. All right, so in 3rd place, we had myself playing the Korra Lock deck that I think was one of the more recent videos on my channel, where I profiled a list very similar to this. I don't think I changed too much. I think I had a Milporo in the deck. I think I had a second Blaze Helix maybe. I forget exactly off the top of my head. I had a Maddening Whispers. I think those were the 3 cards where I ended up kind of last second taking out the Maddening Whispers for a Toxic Fog, which I kind of regretted, but I also dropped the Milporo for the Spire Widow, and I believe whatever the last card was for a 4th 1-mana blocker, which I kind of liked having in the deck. But I won't go over too much in of the actual list itself. As far as my tournament, I think I went 3-1 in the pod stages, which was nice, losing to Caleb, kind of beating everyone else somewhat convincingly 2-0. I think none of my matches were particularly tough in the group stages, but against Caleb, I think I played very, very poorly game 2. Game 1 maybe a bit unfortunate in some areas, also just not the best play, and his deck kind of delivered on some stuff. I don't know exactly. I felt like the match against Caleb, I think very high variance, and I want to say my deck was kind of favored based on my experience going in, but I mean, you can never be too sure about those things. And obviously I just made a really, really horrible mana charge in game 2 that basically single-handedly lost me a game that I probably should have just won fairly easily if I had not made that play. I basically just, I won't go too much into it, but I didn't charge. I charged a Thunder Cruiser that I needed to draw for Reverberate, and then played Reverberate hoping to draw the Thunder Cruiser that I basically just charged for some reason, which doesn't really make sense, because then the following turn I wasn't able to play Cetus, and I basically wasted like 4 mana that turn, and just easily lost the game from there, and just was down like way I was just down horrendous compared to where I should have been in that position. So just a huge, massive punt there that basically just lost me the match outright. And then I went 3-1, and then into top 4 I played against Claude, who ended up finishing 2nd place, of course. And he was on the mono water deck. This was another matchup I felt was slightly favored, again, kind of high variance. All the matchups with Korolok can be high variance. I think on average, again, I feel like both matches were maybe slightly favored, but nothing ridiculously favored, so it's well within the realm of reason to lose those kinds of matches. And they were the kind of games that I don't think were the higher end of what Korolok can do. And unfortunately, also when those kinds of games happen, they can be tricky to navigate. So maybe they were still matches that Korolok, this deck, could have won, but there's a number of games, like you play a ton of different kinds of games with this deck. Some of them are very easy when things show up in the right way, and then and that happens enough for the matchups to be kind of favored. But then there's other games where things are a lot trickier to navigate, and maybe the deck is still good enough to win those. You just have to play really tightly, and maybe one of the games in that match was that kind of game, and I wasn't able to pull my end of the weight with when the deck could have maybe won a game still, despite maybe not delivering the higher end of its draw capability. So regardless, I don't think I was too pleased with my overall level of play in the tournament, but it is a tricky deck to pilot, lots of decisions, so I can't fault myself too much. Not like my opponents were necessarily playing perfectly either, so I don't know, maybe it's just one of those things. But regardless, I ended up losing another tight match against Claude 2-1. I think game one was really interesting, though, as it was kind of a game where I was sort of up against it and ended up having to just kind of race him with a Cetus board. Maybe a little bit of unfamiliarity from Claude in that matchup, where one of the things you're looking for is making sure you're not tunnel visioning on lethal setups, because his deck had no shield blast, so that's something you kind of want to pick your spots with and make sure you're not not tunnel visioning, and making sure you're keeping out for that. And then he kind of maybe got baited into a block that set me up for a 2-turn lethal, which was kind of nice. And then so I was able to kind of steal game one that way, but then the other two were just kind of, again, games where he was able to just kind of keep the pressure on with evolutions at certain stages, and my deck just couldn't really deliver the answers, and had some really tricky spots that maybe with perfect play I could have gotten out of, but did not have perfect play perhaps. So, but yeah, overall, again, the deck did fine. I think, again, I ended up playing Otai, of course, in the third, fourth matchup, which was another 2-0 kind of victory, where my deck, I think at one of the games, maybe I needed a kind of a shield blast at some point that kind of bailed me out of a potentially sticky situation. But from there, in both games, I think were fairly comfortable wins. So I think all my wins were 2-0, and then I played that tight match against Claude that was 2-1, and then an 0-2 loss to Caleb. So I think overall the deck performed pretty well in games. I think I won 9 of 13 games that I played, I believe. 4-2 in matches. So not the worst performance. Again, I think all the matches I had were in my favor at the very least. So I think like the deck itself was a decent enough pick. Was maybe on the positive side of every matchup I played. But again, my level of play in some of the matches was maybe not up to where it needed to be. But yeah, I think going forward with the deck list, I'm really not sure exactly what I would want to change. Like I said, I kind of regretted not playing Maddening Whispers. I went for Toxic Fog because I was kind of worried about some of the nature stuff, just wanting some kind of sweeper effect, just to handle some small creatures, some extra cheap sweeper effect, that is. So one of the other situations that I was kind of hedging towards with the Toxic Fog was some really niche situations that came up in testing with, it was really not a huge deal, but dealing with cards like Supreme Dragon Bullshack, because one of the decks on my radar was actually a dragon deck from Louis, and then it just so happened that Darksteiner ended up playing a dragon deck that also played Supreme Dragon Bullshack, which was, I guess, something else I was expecting. I had a feeling Darksteiner would bring an Oath Dragon deck, but I wasn't sure if he was going to bring his build or if he was going to go for the full power build. He ended up going for Bullshack, so it kind of worked out that there was a Bullshack deck in the field, because, like I'm getting to, Toxic Fog was kind of something to hedge in that direction, because a play pattern that would often come up is Supreme Dragon Bullshack can be a difficult card to answer. One of the ways you do it is just like chump blocking it and then just keeping a Slayer in play. That's fairly simple enough. It just prevents it from attacking, but then maybe they sit back and try to build a board. It can be a little bit awkward. You have Blaze Helix to kind of contend with that, but again, still kind of awkward. But like for the most part, Slayers can kind of answer it. But another thing that you can do is just chill on Andromeda and then just Toxic Fog, and then Andromeda can attack over the Bullshack. So it would just give you another out to kind of cleanly answer a Bullshack with different setups, because in those Dragon matchups you are trying to often go for that Andromeda to stabilize the board and get a big threat in play that can answer most of their Dragons via combat by just when you start tapping their stuff. So because you're going for that, Toxic Fog is just like a kind of convenient card. But overall, the main purpose of the card was for just having a kind of cheap, searchable, -1000 power card. Definitely relevant in the match against Claude, for sure, just having that removal. I think it was actually the removal spell that ended up being utilized to kind of push through that game 1 lethal win against him. But yeah, very helpful. In testing, there were some cute situations where, like, you play Toxic Fog and then you attack over like the Finbar that buffs all the Cyberlords in combat, and then all their stuff dies afterwards. So there were some cute situations that could come up like that. But yeah, Toxic Fog just added a little bit of utility. But I think overall, I kind of miss having a card like Maddening Whispers. It's just a nice kind of searchable discard spell to help bridge some of the early game stuff in slower matchups. So really torn on that spot. I think Horror Box was completely unnecessary in this tournament. I think I don't know, it just feels like such maybe an unnecessary hedge. Like, obviously it's a kind of cute card, but I've been thinking maybe it might just be better to just run a one-of card like Haven. Because again, if we're getting into those niche situations of wanting some in-play answer to something like a Supreme Dragon Bullshack, like I was kind of touching on, some top deck speed attacker, obviously you, again, like I said, you can usually just chump block it and it's not a problem. But if you want some way to just actually outright kind of dead that card or answer it, something like an Eternal Haven can just be that wall that insulates you from a top deck speed attacker that you can just go get in play. And then it gives you the ability to much more easily just set up and actually just kill your opponent via attacking without much resistance, rather than going for the deck out plan. But at the same time, you can probably do that often enough without a card like Haven. Just go for the attacking plans or something like that. But in some matchups, like I said, Horrorbox is really just a hedge, because some matchups you really are scared of their shield zone, even if you take certain approaches. Like, all they need is like a Storm Spark and shields, and then maybe they get a Darkness, and then you're kind of up against it because if they get enough cards out of their shields. So it is kind of just a corner case hedge card, especially for heavier control decks that take a lot of time to answer and deal with before you can set up your lock and get into a really favorable position. So it has its uses, but again, it is a hedge, and it was sort of completely unnecessary for this tournament. So it's kind of dead weight, but it is kind of a meta call type thing, and maybe just completely unnecessary altogether. Still not sure on that one. The only other things I've been really contemplating are just some way to help solve like the evolution aggro matchups, like mono nature type decks. Some way to better solve them, at least. It wouldn't really solve stuff like the Boingus deck, where he has all these defensive blasts, but against mono nature, water nature, these low defense nature aggro decks, I was thinking about a card like Regent Sasha, just because you have a lot of these residual baits, and then you can just kind of set up situations where you just kill them. Like, if you have an attacker or two, you can very easily just like drop a Sasha, break all their shields, or do whatever, and then just kind of just steal a game that way. Like, you don't have to focus on locking, because if their shields are down or if their guard's down or whatever, you can very somewhat easily go for that plan. So I've been thinking about that card. I tested it a bit. I don't know if it was really performing the way I envisioned, so I'm still not sure on that. Another card is just, again, going back to that Eternal Haven, especially against Boulder Fist decks. Like, if you can contain the rest of what they're doing, if they do fist you, yeah, if they do fist you and put you up a bunch of mana, Haven is a nice counter to that, because you can just drop a big threat that answers the fist that they can't really get through at that point. So Haven is another kind of somewhat counterplay to Boulder Fist. So that's another card I've been thinking about, but obviously not quite, maybe not quite as useful as something like Sasha. But I've been trying to think of ways to solve that matchup, those kinds of matchups. I think another thing that could have been nice is just like a Hovercraft Glurgle, especially against these very interaction light decks. Again, going back to mono nature, but the problem there is Boulder Fist once again. Hovercraft is really poor against that plan, because if you just try to build these chump blocking walls, they can just sit back, get the Boulder Fist, which is one of the big problems with that matchup. But the fact that you can just kind of sit behind a Hovercraft and just chump block their evolutions and basically kind of make them dead in that way, just have you these 1 mana basically answers. As long as you can find the discard spells to maybe to back that plan up and have those discard spells target Boulder Fist, then maybe that plan would work. And that Hovercraft inclusion would also be very potent against a deck like Claude's from this tournament, where he has very little in the way of cards that can actually. I mean, he has nothing that can actually remove it completely from my option of playing it. Right, all he can really do is bounce it back to my hand, um, and he only has a few cards in his deck that could do that. So one of the biggest problem card for me in that matchup was Kalorth, and Hovercraft can just answer Kalorth, and then of course I needed to still find some way to deal with Neurons, of course. And with Kalorth in play, that can be kind of harder to do, but you can find ways, and as long as you can just mitigate that pressure from Kalorth, I think like Hovercraft could be a card that solves those matchups. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about. But overall, I really don't know too much of what I would change with an approach to this deck. Like, I don't know, like with the higher blocker count, Cetus kind of approach, like there's obviously a few cards you can tinker with, but I feel like everything kind of has a purpose. And for the most part, I don't really know what to cut. I could think of some cards to add, but I feel like everything kind of feels decent. Like maybe Mystic Water just has been completely unnecessary, so that might be a card I look at cutting. But yeah, I don't know. I feel kind of good about the way it's built for this kind of approach. Like if you're gonna make big changes, like there's kind of some different engines going on here that you kind of have to mess with, and I don't know. Yeah, I feel like if you make changes to this deck, they have to be kind of more sweeping changes, unless they're just like tinkering with one or two slots. So I'm really not really sure where to go in terms of like optimizing this deck if it's not a complete overhaul. So maybe it is good for what it is, which is something I would say. I think similar to some of the other decks I've talked about, I think this is a deck that it definitely looks bad, even when I look at it. But it still is. It plays and performs better than it looks, I think. But at the same time, it does have some consistency issues. It can be clunky. There are some games where your deck just doesn't really deliver on anything, and you do just kind of lose those games, unfortunately. There are other games where they're very tricky to navigate, and maybe you can pull out some wins, and then there are other games where the deck just does exactly what it wants to do, and it's kind of easy. So there is a lot of kind of variance to this deck, to be honest. But at the same time, there are just a lot of really kind of intricate, rewarding games to play. So it is a fun deck. Maybe not for your opponent, but yeah, I don't know. I think it's been pretty decent. Again, I was sort of happy with the tournament performance. I mean, no, I mean, I wish I could have done better, and I think the deck could have done better, but regardless, I think decent tournament overall for the deck, and I think shows that it has some. It's not the worst. It's definitely not the worst. Has some decency to it, and I think the list is pretty good for what it is at this point. But like I said, I think there's definitely some cards I'm thinking about, and I'm still looking for solutions to some kind of matchups. But yeah, overall, been fairly happy with it. So. Yeah, that was the Coral Lock that I brought and ended up going third place. And we'll move on to the final two decks. All right, so talking about the second place deck here, we have Claude Alpha's Mono Water list. So obviously Claude has been playing some of these Neuron decks for the last few tournaments and was previously on like Water Dark with Ramus, and this time has just moved to completely Mono Water. And pretty interesting list for sure. So I think just to go over his tournament, I think he went 4-0, was the only player to go 4-0, kind of just tore through the pod, beat everyone, I'm pretty sure. I think there were some close matches in there, at least. Like, I think Louis went to game 3. I think the match against Otai also went to game 3. The other two, I think Darksteiner, he kind of had the good draws, the chain the evolutions, and just kind of tore through him. I'm not sure exactly how the one against Stents went. I think that might have been another one where Stents just didn't have the shield blast, the types of stuff he might have needed. But it seemed like a tough matchup for him regardless. And then, so yeah, his tournament in the pod stage went pretty well. In top 4, as I just talked about, he ended up taking me down in a pretty tight match. And then the finals ended up losing to Caleb. I believe just maybe some, I think, I didn't watch the matches myself yet, at least at the time of recording, and I think there might have been maybe some tough luck with Plata breaking an early shield that could remove it from play, and then maybe not seeing the right stuff early enough, and then Vang kind of being a menace against these kind of small ball creature decks. So yeah, overall, I mean, he had a strong performance, going 5-1 with the deck at the very least. So I guess getting into the list, it is kind of it does go for the more low to the ground approach with just the high 1-drop count. And of course, the main cards here are Neuron and Emperor Palata. And similar to maybe Darksiders Taksha deck, where you were playing Taksha, a bunch of 1-drops, Torhelm, with that same pile of 1-drops. And you are kind of trying to chain those evolutions together and just kind of keep that momentum going. So yeah, that is sort of the idea behind the deck. You either get that Palata and then just kind of chain that maybe into a Neuron follow-up. It can be really strong when you just start beating in with those evolutions, particularly against against decks that lack good answers to those cards. So yeah, I think kind of similar. I know I had somewhat recently actually built some Mono Water lists that look quite similar, but I had gone with some different approaches. I was of course playing Dendrite, but I think Calorith is probably the better card. Just like having that more powerful, difficult to answer threat is quite strong. So I think that's pretty reasonable. And then I think most of the rest of the stuff, one of the other big cards that I wasn't playing was something like Finbar, Council of Logos, and maybe playing just a default card like Predator. But I think my lists were also quite unpolished when I was playing this deck. I tried building some lists that were even lower to the ground, just like the full 9 1-drops with stuff like Shore Chomper to just have a really efficient kind of deck, and then playing Master Trader as extra refill. But I know Claude made the point that Master Trader is a bit redundant when you're chaining evolutions with like stuff like Palata and Neuron. I don't fully like. I definitely kind of agree with that to an extent, but at the same time, Master Trader can still be a powerful top deck in certain spots and a powerful card to have access to in some degree. But it definitely is maybe just hoping for or a card that's set up for the kind of games you're probably losing. But it is also the kind of card that can bail you out of a game you're losing. But so it kind of goes both ways, but it is overall just kind of a 5-drop. But as I was getting to, my lists were usually maybe even a little more low to the ground. Again, just Short Chomper, though, really kind of a bad card. And then I was playing a lot of just like cheap bounce spells, but I found the bounce spells, stuff like Ice Blades and whatever the one that might bounce like a 4K or less, or trying combinations of those kinds of cards. Definitely kind of underwhelming, and this list kind of forgoes those things, just adds more in the way of 2-drops and such. And then Seneschal, the Hovercraft Girl is obviously quite strong in a lot of matchups. Just having the 1-drops to block and then come back to hand can be good, or just protect your evolutions from combat. It's pretty decent at times. Again, like I mentioned, the Finbar I think is... I'm not sold on this card, but I know it's something, even playing a lot of testing matches against Luxby, who was also working on some Cyberlord decks, it was a card that he moved towards as well. Just wanting more ways to kind of help those evolutions like Neuron outsize certain things. I think in aggro matchups it can be quite important. Just having your Palatas like beat over stuff like Takshas, or beat over stuff like Prison Blade Descendants, or not be in direct threat of something like Blinder Beetle Prime, perhaps, although Blinder Beetle Prime can kind of break the board in different ways, even with Finbar on it. But you can set up these kind of house of cards where it's a little bit difficult for your opponent to answer your evolutions when you have stuff like Hovercraft and Finbar. So they're all ways to just kind of keep those Evos riding along. So it's decent. Also protects your small stuff from mass removal type effects like Barrage or Rothis or what have you. So can still be kind of useful there, but maybe not the most widely applicable. Like a card like Suffocate would still wipe the Finbar and then wipe everything else after. Or a card like Drillstorm would still answer the Finbar and then clear the 1,000 power creatures. So it's not the most effective there, but I think it is a lot about just helping your stuff with outsize certain things. Like if you're playing against Mono Nature, getting to be on the play, maybe leading with a Neuron and then following up with a Finbar. Now they're charging Great Claw, for example, is a lot less effective at answering the board. So I think that's where it really shines. But yeah, I think it's a decent card for sure. It has its role, but I think it's overall kind of a weak card, and I'm not really sure if it's necessary, but it definitely plays its role. So I think overall The deck is definitely fine. I think a lot of the same issues that I have with the Neuron decks in general still transfer over to this kind of list. I think compared to a lot of other aggro decks in the game, which are a lot about just like the matchup, I think this is one of the decks that does rely more on the dice roll than a lot of other aggro decks. Like the dice roll can always be important, but I think this is one where the percentage that you get out of winning versus losing is a fair bit more significant on average. So I think you could see that as a plus. You could see that as a negative. That is one aspect of the deck though that I think is realistic that you kind of have to acknowledge. The other thing, I mean, it is also like kind of you are going kind of all in on some of these plays. Like obviously not all in, like Palada, but Palada is a big investment, right? And there are a lot of games where you just break in and they have the answer in the first two shields, and you are just, even though you're getting 2 cards back, you're down 3 cards. You're giving your opponent the shield kind of for free in a sense. So like they're down a card playing the Bone Blades or Terror Pit or whatever, but they're not actually really down a card, and they're answering your 3 cards and your first 3 turns of the game, which is kind of a big deal when you're an aggro deck. So it can be tough to recover from those spots, unless you have like just really powerful chains of draws, or your opponent just doesn't have much of a follow up. But you are kind of playing with fire, and a lot of games can get decided by those first couple shields. Same thing with Neuron, even the first 2 shields. But you can also run away with the game. So it is a bit more of a high variance deck, I think, than some of the other aggro decks out there. But I think it is obviously a decent deck for sure. I think mono water, like all the other mono decks, is fairly viable. I don't think this is the perfect list, but it definitely is a pretty good approach. I think, like I said, I don't know exactly too much of what I would change. I think General Finbar is a card that Claude mentioned wishing he hadn't played. He wanted to play Ice Blades instead. Just Finbar, it can come up. It's a nice like mid-game draw in certain spots at times, but it is just a 6-drop that maybe not necessary. So that's one card in question. And then I think the big card for me that really just underperformed in all the games I played with this deck was Aqua Seneschal. Like, there are some games where you have like Seneschal and then you follow it up with a Finbar, and it makes it big and you can do some stuff. But for the most part, this card is just quite slow. Yeah, it just wasn't very good when I had played with it. And honestly, for me personally, I know Claude has been talking about wanting to play a full set of 3 Ice Blades, which I think is a decent card. But as I kind of mentioned earlier, when I was playing mono water decks, I had tried playing like higher counts of these cheap tempo spells, and I felt like they made sense theoretically with like all these draw effects. You just want to chain stuff and make disruptive plays and curve out, and I think that works. But at the end of the day, I still felt like those cards were somewhat underwhelming, and I really think that maybe this deck could benefit the most from 3 copies of Stormspark, just to give you that out, especially with the evolutions in your deck. Like, there's so many matchups, like even against something like Caleb's deck, for example, like one of your big win conditions you can play towards is just like his deck has no discard. If you're an aggro deck, you just throw your resources and just, if you're like, you don't even have to necessarily win the game, right? You can just get him down to 0 shields, and then you just sit on an evolution in hand, and then you play to your like 33% chance of having a Stormspark in your shields every game, right? And then you can just win as long as you can get. It's like the same thing a lot of rush decks do in Kaijudo too. Is they're not like, compared to other games like Duel Masters, you're a lot worse at just blitzing your opponent down, but you can definitely get them down to 0 shields. And if you can do that, like you have Stormspark as that inevitable kind of reach that you can play towards, like those last percentage points. And I think Stormspark could go, like, if you're going to play at a high impact Shield Blast, which I think you want in this deck, to be honest, you can afford to play 3 Stormsparks, and I think this deck probably should. Because, yeah, I think that was one of the big problems with this list, is just having no Shield Blast makes it way too easy to exploit, honestly. And that was one of the things, I played a lot with this deck as well, in a variety of different matches, just seeing how it shaped up, and I felt like it really underperformed against a number of aggro decks, to be honest. Like, I think this deck, maybe as expected, maybe not, I don't know, but it really has a very difficult time beating Monolight. I think a card like Stormspark could help alleviate some of that, but it's just way too easy for Monolite to just sit back, build a board. Whether it's Storm Spark or Blinder Beetle Prime, you just tap some stuff and then just kill them in one shot. This deck is part of the problem. It's like forced to be the one to maybe make the first move, attack in to recoup some cards, and you can't do the same build a board in one shot against a deck with like 9 Shield Blasts. It's not going to work as often, so maybe you have to chip them down, or maybe you just play to the percent chance that they don't have a Shield Blast. Either way, you're in a really rough spot, and Monolite can just find a way to just kind of push through, whether they chip a shield or two early, and it's basically just super trivial to get the last points of damage from there. So I think you really do need some Shield Blast that can just steal a game, and I think Storm Spark's that card. Because yeah, like I said, I think I tested it. I think like this deck, it looks like it should really trounce Rush, to be honest, and I felt like even that matchup, Rush could take kind of exploitative lines of play, and just even Rush could be a tricky matchup, not as good as you would think it would be for a mono water deck or a Neuron. Like traditionally Neuron decks, these like all these cheap blockers and stuff like Blurple of old, like those decks used to be very strong against Rush, and I feel like this deck is a lot weaker against that matchup than you'd think it would be. Maybe it's still like close or 50-50-ish, but yeah, it's a lot not as good as you like it to be. Again, Monolite, very difficult to beat. I think Mono Nature even is maybe a high variance matchup. That's one that's a lot more play draw dependent, whether you have the early evolutions, but even Mono Nature can be tricky at times if they have a decent draw, or Sumo Artichoke and Shields. Like you can lose those matchups. Water Nature aggro I felt like was a bad matchup. Mono Dark deck that Gareth brought last tournament, like that kind of deck, I felt like that was a bad match. Like I feel like this deck, it's overall, again, I think it's still a decent deck, but I think it is on the losing end of a number of different aggro matchups, whether it's like close to quite terrible. It's not the best in a number of those matchups, and I think there's things you could do to alleviate that. Against Control, I think it's pretty decent. Obviously, it was good enough to beat like my Coral Lock deck, for example. Again, I felt like Coral Lock was still favored against this deck, to be fair. So, but other control decks, maybe you have a decent chance. It is like I said, it's very high variance against Control in particular too, because again, winning the die roll with a deck like this, your Neuron, your Palada, they get under Mesmerize. But you have Scamp, obviously. Scamp on the draw even can help you play through Mesmerize, or just having 6 different 3-drop evolutions can help you play Mesmerize on its own. But regardless, getting those things under Bone Blades is also the big deal, because on the play, your Neuron gets 2 attacks or whatever before they can Bone Blades it, whereas on the draw, you get 1 attack. That's a huge difference. And again, just dodging those early Shield Blasts is just a huge, huge deal, I guess, with most aggro decks, but other aggro decks have a little bit more resiliency, I would say. So, because with this deck, you're kind of playing your shot right off the bat. You're just kind of like making a big move right off the bat. Other aggro decks, they don't commit as much early on for potentially. So, yeah, it's again, I think it's a decent deck overall. Maybe a little needs a bit of work in a lot of the aggro matchups, because I think it is a bit too easy. Even with like all the blockers and the hovergraph package and the cheap evolutions, I just felt like it's not the best against other aggro decks. And yeah, against Control, I think decent, depends on the Control deck and how you draw, but overall pretty fine deck. And I think it is to be said, like this kind of deck, I think all the mono decks are like at least like fairly decent at least. I don't know what maybe the best or worst are. I would say like I think Mono Light and Mono Nature are more proven. I think Mono Fire Rush, I'm still really not sure on the best list for that kind of deck, but Mono Fire should be like fairly good in some form. Mono Water, again, I haven't really seen like a perfect list or a list that I really thought was like I don't know what the really pinnacle list of that would look like, but definitely something similar to this at the very least. And I think that's a totally valid archetype as well. I might have it a little bit on the lower end of the mono decks. And then Mono Darkness, of course, maybe one of the more flexible in terms of how you can build it, whether it's like a more aggressive deck, And to be honest, like when we look at the kind of mono dark deck that Gareth played in the last tournament, I would kind of lump that in as like in the same territory as this deck, where it definitely has some flaws, some weaknesses, but at the same time it can play a good aggressive game. I think mono dark is a lot better in a number of aggro matchups than this deck, whereas this deck is probably a lot better against a number of control matchups. But I would have those decks sort of in the similar territory as like kind of decent, like tier 2-ish, maybe 2.5-ish deck. And then of course mono dark also has the approach of just like as we'll see, like something like Caleb's deck is just like the more mid-rangey, control-y kind of approaches, like Kalima style, that kind of stuff. So mono dark has the widest variety of things that you can do, but is also one where it's a little unknown. Mono water, I think, is the mono deck where we kind of know you have to build something aggressive, but the optimal like evolution choices, the optimal 3-drop choices, the shield blast choices, all that kind of stuff. I think it's still a little underexplored. So those, I think mono dark and mono water have the most like kind of work to do in terms of getting somewhere. And then mono fire, I mean, like I said, I still don't really know exactly. We kind of know all the good rush cards, but the exact configuration is something that I always kind of flip flop on. I'm not really sure. But yeah, so yeah, this deck overall, like I said, pretty decent deck. Yeah, I personally, again, like I would say the main change I would make is just adding 3 Storm Sparks. I don't know, maybe you could still add like an Ice Blades over the Finbar, the general Finbar. Maybe you want like the 9th 1-drop, probably not. Maybe you want, I don't know, there's not much else that's really needed. I don't know, maybe it's just like a one-off. Maybe you keep like 1 Seneschal, maybe, I don't know, seems kind of bad, I don't really know. Maybe you add like a Psychic Predator Resalker or something. There's some stuff you could tinker with for sure, but yeah, so that was Claude's mono water deck. Again, good performance, 2nd place, 5-1 finish, so congrats to him. Alright, so we are into the last deck, of course, mono dark midrange from Caleb, taking down the tournament, having a pretty decent performance, going 5-1, beating, I think, everyone in our pod except for Papid's Haven deck, and then ended up going into the top 4 where he beat, I think, Otai and Claude. So congrats to him once again. Of course, like, called it mono dark midrange. I guess maybe people would call it mono dark Kalima, but I never really intuitively, when I was looking at the deck, I never really thought of it as a Kalima deck, and I'm not sure Caleb does either. It's just Kalima just happens to be in there. It's kind of course, like something you'd love to hit off Magaria. To be honest, though, I don't know, maybe I can get into it more later, but I think in testing this deck against a number of different matchups, I felt like you do want the 3rd Kalima in there, to be honest. Like, it is just not even just for like the extra high roll potential, just having one more really, really nice hit off Magaria. Just, it's really crucial for those like Haven and Dragon matchups in particular, I think. So, because I found like playing Oath Dragons against this deck, like, not a great matchup for this. It was too easy to just play this like exploitative, like, build a board, go up to my Haven or go up to Awakened, and then just kind of lock you out. And with only 2 Kalimas, it's not like consistent enough that you find it in time to really compete on that axis. And then you're leaning more on the high roll generic stuff of the deck has, which doesn't always line up too great if Dragons gets out ahead. So anyways, like, I digress a bit, but like I felt like 3 Kalima was very often a card in those matchups where you really, really want to see it, and you really can capably hardcast it, and it was just not something you see frequent enough, which was I think a little bit of something I wasn't a fan of. So I think you could go to 3 Kalima. I still wouldn't really like consider it a Kalima deck. Is mostly just like the main core, I guess, is like the 9 cards, the Malphagus, the Megaria, and the Agrics. It's just, of course, it's all about like that recursion and like getting multiple bodies off of your cards, which I think is like a really nice use of Megaria, because I think Megaria often gets like pigeonholed into these like super kind of janky, like, let's Veil Slip in Megaria and drop like mill 3 different monarchs and try to like hit one of them, basically, or like that kind of stuff, or just playing Megaria and like 49 drop creatures or whatever. It's just usually gets pigeonholed into that kind of nonsense, whereas this deck is like playing it much more in the kind of straight up, like just playing it for 2 bodies. And of course it has like the super top high end, like mill another 6 drop or whatever, hit that. Mill your Kalima, of course, is really nonsense, but for the most part, just like playing it, getting 2 bodies. Now, of course, like I say that, but it still isn't like you're still trying to get lucky, because of course, like if you just play it and get like a random blocker, it's like decent, but never really good enough in most matchups. Like it's kind of not doing much. Or if you mill a removal spell, you're like drawing a removal spell, which is fine. Like you are still trying to kind of get lucky and hit 2 cards. So it's kind of the same thing, but you don't have to build Magaria in this super greedy way. I guess that's the main point. You don't have to look at it as a meme card and just like try to build around it to cheat out like 9+ drops. Like, and that's all that it can do. And you just play it kind of in just like a straight up deck like this, and you try to get lucky, but you don't have to like play you don't have to just warp your deck super crazily to handle it. You can just play it in something with a pretty balanced curve. So again, like against control, that's really kind of your plan, is to sort of get out ahead. And I think it works pretty well, where you just draw pass a lot. You just make land drops, and then you just eventually just start playing 6 mana double breakers, and then you just have this resilient threat game where you just kind of go off with like Vangs. And Malphagus is a card that I don't really love, but it works well enough for the deck, I guess. One of the big selling points of this is that you're just pretty resilient to discard, because like your opponent's mesmerizes, it puts them in really awkward spots where like they want to mesmerize like the Malphagus or whatever, because like if they don't mesmerize the Malphagus, then you just have like a juicy target. If you discard like an Agrix or something else, then all of a sudden their Malphagus is live, right? And so like against control decks, like you're very often like not putting stuff in your own graveyard unless they're putting it in your graveyard with like their discard spells, right? And so your graveyard, by the time you get to like your Magaria, is like empty, and then you just mill 3 and like you have decent chances at that one of those big hits, right? Which is like a reason to not just like play Gloom Hollows and get them Bone Blades and then just have like crappy cards in your discard pile for Magaria, right? So being immune to discard was just, it's like really tough, because like you see a hand of all this recursion stuff, and like they all kind of, the recursion kind of gets better depending on what you mesmerize, and it just makes it awkward to play against, which was pretty nice and an appealing part of this deck. That said, like even against control, like it's pretty slow. Like you are just like going, okay, let me play a 6 drop, then let me play Magaria. It is very high variance. Like a lot of games are just like, does the Magaria hit something crazy or not? If not, like you probably lose a lot of the time. If the Malphagus doesn't win a clash, a lot of games can come down to that, and that's, I mean, it's not the best place to be, because it leads to a lot of swingy games. But I think against some control decks, like I tested this deck against my Light Nature Haven deck, and it was kind of scary, because like those boards get out of hand and the recursion is really difficult. But again, I was thinking, like I was getting at earlier, I think that's a matchup still where you really want like the 3rd Kalima, because not seeing it enough can be kind of an issue. But just like going super wide is just like just presenting multiple big threats against control decks, and it's not the easiest thing to pick apart. Like I said, it's hard with discards, and then not a lot of control decks are really built to handle like all these like high, like mid-cost creatures. Like Terror Pit in Kaijudo is just a slow, like it's 7 mana, right? It's getting outpaced. So it's really hard to kind of like tempo answer. Like not a lot of control decks have those tempo answers, right? Like I guess you have Lyra and stuff, which is pretty good, but then you're kind of trading off, and Magaria outsizes some of it. So like not a lot of the control decks are super well equipped. Like I felt like my Coral Lock deck, overall I did feel like my deck was favored. Obviously like in the actual matchup, I basically punted game 2. Like I should have won that game, I think. And then game 1 just kind of unlucky, and maybe not using my crystal memories wisely enough. But very difficult matchup to play, I guess. But yeah, I just super punted. So I think that matchup overall was favored for Coralock, just because like this deck does come down to like some high variance points, and if the control decks have the kind of answers or enough answers. But yeah, just outpacing, like if you think about like just normal Haven decks, again, you're kind of resilient to the discard, and then the removal spells are just very expensive, and then you're just out grinding them through those removal, and then you have Kalima to go over the top of Havens and kind of push through. Again, I'd like the Klima to be more consistent, but still, like, you have that aspect down, and then just Agrics just being a huge threat. So even stuff like Time Loss Phantom, you can go for the aggressive like Time Loss Phantom and Underworld Stalker kind of beatdown stuff at times, which is okay. Slithering Phantasm, I think, is like the worst. It's just really bad. Again, you can go for these like beatdown lines against maybe aggro decks or just whatever, depending on your hand. Slithering Phantasm, though, I think it's a card like if you it just punts away like winning percentage chances, right? Because you can go for like maybe you're just like, okay, let's just say you have a hand, you're 50% to win the game with your hand, and then you have this Slithering Phantasm line. You can take the Phantasm line and it puts your opponent on this like in this weird like, do they have the answers? Can they do anything? Like, how's it gonna play out? And it asks this like important question, right? And you can go for that line, and you might still have like be able to kind of win the game, but you're just like now you're just 33% to win the game instead of 50% because you went for this Phantasm line that's just super high roll, and it's just gonna decide the game then basically at that point, and you're just punting away like 17% win obviously I'm making up these percentages, but it just feels like you can still win when you go for these Phantasm lines, but you're just like chopping off like a bunch of your win percentage chances when you go for those lines. So I think it's just like kind of risky way to play the game, and not really needed. I think it is like kind of nice at times against certain aggro decks to just have that kind of looming presence, but I think you could do way better just not having a Vortex in that slot. I think having like if you I like having access to like an evolution, maybe like Infernal Taskmaster, maybe just like Oblivion Knight, just even the Ravenous Whip Tongue, just like having those like cheap, like I like having an evolution. I think Phantasm sucks in this deck though. So I wouldn't play that. I think any of the other ones, just having some option to like get back with Agrics is also really nice, especially if you're like stocking your graveyard a bit. You can just like play the Agrics, put that evolution even on the Agrics, and just build your own Bolt Tail, right? It's that kind of funny thing. But yeah, just having an evolution, some aspect I like having. I just think the Slithering Phantasm is not the call. It's just like too bad because you have to against aggro, you have to put it on your blockers, and you just prefer like you want that kind of surprise attacker type like Major Owl kind of like revenge kill board thing. But yeah, Slithering Phantasm being a Vortex makes it too unwieldy. So yeah, I didn't like that card. But yeah, getting into how this deck plays against aggro, I guess, because again, I went over control. Like, it can be scary if you just because you're really consistent at seeing those big things, and you just hold them and you just pass all the other turns. So the bad matchups in control wise, like I tested this deck against my Water Dark Fire Nature control, and it was awful against that deck, which I found kind of surprising. But then you just realize like the Water Dark Fire Nature control is very consistent, just generates advantage, and it has those multi-card answers like Absolute Incineration and Absolute Darkness and that kind of stuff. So you're just way more consistent, and when this deck is just draw passing a bunch of turns, it just doesn't play out that well. Like the games it wins were like the few games where you're one of those, some of those threats slip through, and then you have that like nutty Magaria into like Agrics that buys back like a Malphagus that you milled all off the one Magaria, right? Like those kinds of games, you need those. And even then, like you wouldn't always win those games. It was kind of funny that way. So I just felt like against controls, like if they generate a ton of advantage, get out ahead, and they have those answers, which the controls are going to be more consistent. They're going to have free reign in the early game to like. But there's not a lot of control decks, I guess, that do that. It really depends, like who out here is playing Water Dark Fire Nature control. Is that even the meta deck? I don't know. And then most of the Haven piles are just these like clunky, greedy things that, yeah, they just give this deck free reign too. So in those matchups where they're not being challenged, then again, like I said, you just spit out these like big things and just put out two things at once. And if they're trying to like root trap or terror pit one of them, like they're just falling behind. And then they get to their late game too late where you're just like hitting them over the head with double breakers. So that's kind of the idea. And then again, Klima pushes through. So against control, it can be scary. I think certain controls handle this deck really well. The Coral Lock, I said, I think it was favored against this deck. The problem is Coral Lock has its own clunkiness. I'd kind of talk about this deck and Coral Lock in similar terms where they both like look bad on paper, I think, but they play better than they look, which I think is kind of reasonable. But yeah, so this deck against aggro, I think obviously you have 15 blasts, which is really what you're leaning on. It's basically 15 blasts and Vang. That's really it. You can also take those aggressive, like you can take some more aggressive racy lines because you have those cheap attackers with Stalker, Phantasm, and Gloom Hollow, and you can try to treat cheese wins that way, which is like kind of comes up like against a deck like Water Nature aggro, which I think one of the flaws with Water Nature aggro is the low defense. Like you can just kind of get cheese like that where you can kind of just get back-footed with a bunch of small creature hands, and then that can be a problem. So like this deck going for those kinds of lines where you just take this like mid-range aggressive beatdown plan is, I mean, that's how this deck can kind of steal wins. But if you don't have the cards to do that, like I found like this deck against aggro was worse than I thought it would be, because again, you look at 15 blasts and Vang, and part of the problem I found was like you are leaning super hard on those Vangs because the rest of the deck, it really sucks, and you have the 15 blasts, but the problem is like when the rest of your deck sucks against aggro, you can't just have like one blast. Like you need three. Like this deck was consistently like requiring 3 to 4 blasts to have a chance at winning in a bunch of matchups, which I felt like is troublesome because you have 15 blasts, but you're not going to have 3 to 4 blasts every game, right? So you're demanding a lot out of your shields. So yes, you play a lot of shield blasts, but you're demanding a ton. So it's not like the same as just like it's not the same kind of thing because the rest of your deck places demands on your shield zone. Not just, you can't just look at it like, oh, every deck just wants like one blast. No, some decks want more blasts than others, right? And you have to kind of look at that aspect as well. So that's kind of what I found is like you were asking a lot out of your shield zone and having Vang, and there are a lot of aggro matchups where if you draw Vang, it's good. You have good chances. You're pretty good against it. But if you don't draw Vang, you are just like a super underdog. And I feel like matchups like that are kind of like Mono Nature, for example. Like if you don't draw Vang, it's quite a bad matchup. If you do draw Vang, then it's like going to be pretty close. I do think you're still on the underside of that. Like Water Nature aggro, like I just mentioned, you can have some cheesy wins that you have to go for. But if you don't, like even if you draw Vang, I found that matchup to be really, really bad for this deck. Like Water Nature aggro was just crapping on this. And then it's kind of surprisingly too, I tested this deck against like rush decks, like I think mono fire. I think Firelight as well. I forget exactly, but I did test it against some of the fire rush decks. And I also tested this deck against like Monolight, and I found that those matchups were also not as good as you'd think they would be. Again, like having all the blasts and like cards that are normally tricky, like Gloom Hollow, Underworld Stalker, especially in particular for Monolight. Again, like just this deck was just demanding too much out of its shield zone, and like you would just, yeah, you just get put on 0 shields, and then like if they just have Storm Spark, you lose, which was a consistent play pattern that they can play towards. Like they don't have to break all your shields, just having like Storm Spark is just like almost always a win for them, which was really troublesome unless you have just like a really good draw to keep off of 0 shields. And then sometimes they just beat you anyways. And like, yeah, I just found like those matchups that you think would be like slam dunks were just like actively like maybe 50-50. Like maybe you're pushing a little higher than that. It depends. I don't know. But yeah, the fact that those matchups weren't as good as I thought they would be was kind of worrisome. But I think overall, like this deck should be pretty good against aggro or decent against aggro. It's just if you're playing against like higher tier or higher quality aggro decks, it's a little worse. But it really depends. Again, like Water Nature can just play very exploitatively of a deck like this, and then if you don't like get lucky off of Vang Clash or something at times, like you're just gonna get kind of rolled over. And yeah, that's mainly the thing is like it's demanding a lot out of its shield zone. It can be quite bricky, demanding a lot out of its shield zone and demanding a lot of its deck to produce like a Vang or multiple Vangs in order to do well against aggro. Some of the other matchups like I tested like against Dragons, like I mentioned, I think Dragons was kind of problematic because again you're leaning hard on Vang to answer like birds and kind of like compete for the board. Obviously you do have other answers, but like if you don't draw Bone Blades, then like a turn 3 Nyx, especially if you're on the draw, is like getting like multiple, they're getting a lot of value out of it up front, which is pretty bad. So like Nyx can be quite a problem for this stack. And then you don't really want to play your cheap stuff, which is kind of worrisome. And then you get to the mid game and you can, again, like you always have this, like against slower draws, like you can always capitalize with those like Magaria, go wide and then just produce those double breakers, and that can be kind of difficult for Dragons to deal with at times. But for the most part, if Dragons just draws well, they can get out ahead, and as long as they don't get too unlucky in the mid game, just playing towards Awakened is actually kind of a issue for this deck when it comes to the shields, because there's not a lot of hard answers to Awaken, just like the Terrapits. So it was kind of a consistent play pattern where you just build up a big board, dominate the board, a lot of dead draws. You're really hoping on seeing some of this stuff, and then just there are consistent spots where you really want to see Kalima, and just again, I would think that you want 3, but I felt like Dragons could actually be kind of a harder matchup for this deck, which was I did. So I think overall, like, this deck is pretty decent. I wouldn't think of it like insanely highly. Like, it again, it's, I know some people were kind of dismissive of it in talking, like they just felt like it wasn't that good. I played some test matches with Lux B. I mean, going into the event, I was playing a ton with him, testing my deck out list, and then or my Coral Lock list, and then when the deck list came out, I'd asked him to help me play a few matches. He played a few with like Boingus's Dark Nature deck and the Papid's Haven deck, and then I think he played a few games with those decks. I think he even won some, but didn't really like how they played. And then got to this deck, and I think he played like half a game, conceded, called the deck crap, and then just like switched back to his normal decks and didn't want to play it anymore, which was kind of frustrating because I felt like this deck was definitely scary and something I needed to practice first. And like I said, like some people kind of dismissed it. But yeah, it definitely plays better than it looks. So just like it does kind of work, just having the high shield blast count, and then just the mid game engine is just really good. Like again, I think Malphagus is not a card I think is particularly strong. Like it's basically just dead versus aggro decks. Like it's just vanilla. Like it's just I mean, obviously it can do stuff. Like if you are in a position where you've already won, or maybe like you get lucky and whatever. It's against aggro, like most of the stuff is pretty slow. It's basically just, again, like stall, hope to have triggers, hope to have Vang, and then maybe you get up to Agrics and just take over the game and win the game with the Agrics, I guess. But Malphagus is kind of mediocre, but it works well enough for just, again, making you immune to discard against control decks. Just being kind of resilient. But it is just overall kind of high roll. Like, there's a lot of matchups I felt like are just kind of bad unless you get lucky. Whether it's like having a bunch of triggers, having your Vang, and then or just like hitting like a kind of exceedingly good Magaria, or just like a well-timed clash off of Malphagus. So I don't know, it's one of those things where like the deck has a lot of, like, it needs to get lucky, but then it has so many ways to get lucky, that is it really getting lucky, or is that just kind of what the deck does? I would lean a little bit more towards the former, because I don't think the deck is like that great. So not my style. But yeah, overall it is like pretty better than it looks, definitely, and then it plays pretty cohesively. Like again, like I was touching on, I don't think Slithering Phantasm is a good card to play. You could consider some other evolutions. I think the removal spell suite is kind of up there, like, or it's kind of awkward. I don't know exactly what the right mix is. I think Time Lost Phantom, it has a role, like you can play those like kind of aggressive-y games. It felt like against control, you didn't always want to do that. Yeah, I mean, it's good enough. It's kind of awkward though, because like you can just commit it to the board, and then maybe it gets killed, and then it kind of in a roundabout way makes your Magaria worse. Like you definitely want Bone Blades. A Soul Reflection was really good, I think. Like that card just pretty solid. Like playing it in the reviled list and stuff as well. Just this like 5 mana kind of Terrapid-ish card is like pretty good, right? Because earlier I was talking about how like a lot of decks just have like really inefficient 1-for-1 removal to answer big things, right? And Soul Reflection can do that, and with Underworld Stalker it's quite strong, being able to like just kind of draw a card at the same time. So it is another kind of variance card, but it does pretty well. It's great for like answering Stalkers as well. Like you can just, so is Bone Blades, of course. When you have your own Stalker, of course, like that's the asterisk. And Stalker Wars are a big thing. I think another thing that's really troubling for this deck is like Stalker Mirrors. Of course, Underworld Stalker is a really good card against this deck, which was another aspect of like the Water Dark Fire Nature control matchup, where I have the one-off Stalker and I'm really good at finding it, and then you just get that out and then you just answer everything else, and you don't have to worry about Agrics as being good and Magaria's being as good and all that stuff, right? You don't have to worry about Kalima. So like Stalker is very good against this deck, but with Vang and like the Bone Blades and Soul Reflection, you are pretty well equipped with your own Stalker. Like the best answer to Stalker is your own Stalker. You just Stalker plus removal. But that was something that was so annoying about Vang, is in the Stalker mirror. Again, it's so crucial for these decks that like your Stalker sticks and you can get their Stalker to the bottom of the deck. So many games are decided by whether or not Vang wins its clash to give minus 4,000, because you just have to take that risk. You target the Stalker, and then if you win the clash, you probably win the game because you get rid of their Stalker, and then you're just so far ahead. And now the rest of your cards, your engine and all that is online. Your Magaria next turn is like just doing insane. It's doing the most, right? And it's just so annoying that like so many of these games are decided by whether or not like you hit or whiff off Vang, which is just really frustrating part of the gameplay, to be honest. I really hate that play pattern. But yeah, the rest of the deck, I mean, it is still like Vang pairs well with Stalker to get rid of Stalkers. That's kind of like you're decent enough to hit it. So that plus like the Bone Blades and Soul Reflection, I think you do want those cards to situate yourself well for that. Third Terror Pit is another card. Like it's just a good Shield Blast and helps you with those kind of Infernus the Awakened problems. Again, third Kalima is a card I would consider that evolution, like some other evolution. I don't know exactly what to cut though, because like I think most of the deck I feel like it makes sense for what it is. Again, like the only actively bad card I would say was Phantasm, and then like Time Lost is maybe not the best fit. Like you could do away with it, I guess, but at the same time, like you kind of want the cheap thing. But then again, it's like it's like not even that good versus aggro, right? It was like this weird thing where against like Water Nature specifically, it can come up where you just like take this aggressive line and then just like back it up with Shield Blast, and you just I'm the beatdown now is basically what you say, and then you hope it works out, because if you don't do that, like you're just gonna lose kind of deterministically to just Water Nature outvaluing the heck out of you. So it gives you a different way to play, which is kind of what this like deck, it gives you that little bit of flexibility, but it is another high variance aspect. So yeah, I'm not exactly sure, but overall I think the deck was kind of fun to play. I played it a bunch. I think my brother actually also helped me test some matchups and played the deck a fair amount too, and he said he kind of enjoyed it as well, but felt like it was a bit nonsense at the times. But yeah, I think overall the deck is pretty good. So congrats to Caleb for taking it down. I think cool to see all the new people come out this time and play a lot of Vile Piercer or Acre Spider. I always mix those two up, but playing a lot of Darkness Shield Blast, which is a different look than usual. So kind of nice. And guess that pretty much does it for this lengthy recap. So we'll see you for, I guess, Kaijudo Open number 10 coming sometime soon down the down the pipe. Whenever I always usually do these videos like a few months after, maybe even longer. But yeah, thanks all for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.